Even though I always wanted to, I never got around to picking up Wet Tricks for the N64 or Dreamcast. I did, however, end up picking up its nearly unheard of sequel on the PS2 called Aqua Aqua. Wet Tricks is mildly known, more so among N64 gamers, but Aqua Aqua is almost completely forgotten among PS2 gamers. I've owned this game for less than 20 years, but more than 10. I don't really remember when I picked it up, but my copy still has a Blockbuster sales sticker on it from when I bought it used from Blockbuster. Nonetheless, I still haven't seen fit to play any amount into this game outside of a small 6-second clip I used for a montage in 2009. Aqua Aqua is a simple yet complicated puzzle game that is incredibly short in its single player mode, yet still incredibly addictive. Players use geometric shapes that fall from the sky to create lakes to hold water, which also falls from the sky. It basically takes the falling block gameplay of Tetris and takes it into 3D, where those blocks are used to form lakes and pools to house water. If too much water escapes the side of the playfield and fills the gauge on the right side of the screen, it's game over. Eventually, a fireball power-up will fall from the sky to be used to evaporate the water and score points, which also reduces the water in the water gauge. The more water you evaporate, the more points. As the water level rises, players have to stack up the landscape pieces higher to keep it from flowing over the side. Every so often, bombs will fall from the sky, forcing the user to steer them to a safe part of the map to explode as they blow a hole through the bottom of the map, which requires landscape pieces to repair. If your landscape pieces stack up too high, it will trigger an earthquake, which will decimate the landscape, flattening parts of it, allowing all the water to fall off the side. It's really hard to stop the flow of water after an earthquake. Strategic use of the downer pieces in the game lowers the earthquake risk. You can also destroy parts of the landscape with the fire power-up in order to lower the earthquake risk. After the first level, ice cubes will randomly fall from the sky and freeze all the water in whichever lake they land in, causing all the subsequent water dropped in that lake to freeze as well. The ice can be melted by using a fireball or waiting for a rainbow, which shows up after a certain amount of water power-ups have fallen on the landscape. Every time you move up a level in the game speed increases. Players can also play bingo using the square grid at the bottom of the screen to hit a bingo and unlock power-ups for a limited time. The game is definitely complicated to learn at first. I'm still terrible at this game as I've yet to master the scoring and bonus system, but I'm always addictively drawn into its gameplay every time I boot it up. The game offers 3 modes of play: story mode, quick puzzle, and versus for 2-player battles against a friend. The story mode is incredibly short with a whopping 4 levels to play. You can easily beat this game in one sitting. My only real big complaint is the game has a forced training mode you have to complete before you can unlock the story or versus modes. I hate forced training modes, and I gritted my teeth through this training mode just to play the story mode. As the story goes, a billion years ago at the beginning of time. Yeah, no, there is a storyline here, but I don't need my puzzle games to tell me a story. Basically, in the story mode, you have to defeat 4 evil monsters, each with their own levels. 2 of the levels in the story mode took me over 20 minutes to beat with failures and restarts. The other 2 took about 10 to 12 minutes. The entire thing can be beaten in an hour or less. Outside of the forced training mode, the short story mode length is another knock against the game. That being said, the gameplay is so addictive I found myself losing hours upon hours coming back to play the puzzle mode, which is the endless trial mode where the game lasts as long as the player can survive. Even if I am terrible at this game, I've lost hours to this mode just in recording footage for this review. I already know I have hours more footage than I'm gonna use. I would forget I was capturing footage altogether and just get absorbed into this game. I love relaxing and enjoying a good puzzle game, and the endless replayability of the puzzle mode alone makes up for the brevity of the single player mode. The puzzle mode alone will keep you coming back for more long after you've beaten the story mode. Another mode that will keep you coming back is the versus mode. If you have at least one other friend to play this game with, the versus mode also brings endless replay value. In the versus mode, using the bingo at the bottom of the screen can be used to send attacks at your opponent. I wasn't able to fully test the versus mode for this review, but I could easily see my friends and I losing hours and hours defeating each other in this game. Graphically, the game is simple looking by design. The landscapes eventually take that voxely landscape landscape look that a lot of PS2 games like Smuggler's Run had, and the water effects are decent. This game isn't trying to be a graphical powerhouse because it doesn't need to be. Simple game, simple concept, simple visual presentation. However, the landscape deformation in the game is a really cool effect. The only hit to the graphics I can make has to do with the camera angle. Players can tilt the camera, but they can't rotate it, making it hard to see some of the corners on the map when the landscapes get too high. It's a small complaint, but it would have been nice to either rotate the camera or the terrain to see better. I found that using the D-pad was the most accurate way to play this game. The analog controls feel a bit slippery. Part of it could be in the delay of using a modern display, but I found that for those small motions to seed a landscape piece, to make a perfect connection to the piece next to it, tapping the D-pad was worlds more accurate. By comparison, the analog stick feels like each piece is slipping on ice as you move it, giving it an inaccurate feel. Again, it could be because of the upscaling solution I am using, but the slippery feeling isn't there when using the D-pad. Everything else with the controls is as simple as pressing a button to turn each piece in the air before it lands, or to execute a fast fall when you have the piece where you want it. The background music to the game is low-key. It's there, but it doesn't really stand out. It sits nicely in the background and is decent, if not forgettable overall. The chipper and cheery announcer goes well with the bright kitty look of the game. Overall, the sound design is decent, but nothing really stands out about it. The bottom line. Aqua Aqua joins the likes of Bombastic on the list of the most underrated puzzle game sequels on the PS2, and is one of the most addictive underrated offerings in the PS2's library of mostly overlooked underrated puzzle game offerings. There is a serious lack of love for PS2 puzzle games, people, and Aqua Aqua is the Wet Trick sequel that I would wager a guess that most fans of the original never even knew existed. Having not played the original, I can't comment on how it stacks up to Wet Tricks, but I can say this is an absurdly addictive game that is both simple yet complicated. Once you learn the mechanics, Aqua Aqua will then prompt you to give it hours upon hours of your life. The game is still sitting around the $10 mark with shipping as of this video, and for $10, outside of Bombastic, which is the unappreciated sequel to Devil Dice, you won't find a better puzzle game on the PS2 at that price. Seriously, just buy both of them for the best 1-2 punch of puzzle gaming the PS2 has to offer. I'm definitely not kind towards Call of Duty single-player campaigns post-Modern Warfare. I won't go into detail as to why I'm not a mediocre Warfare fan, but in playing through Call of Duty 2, an Xbox 360 launch game I haven't played through since probably around 2008, I was reminded of how much I actually used to like the single-player campaigns in Call of Duty games. I've still never played the original Call of Duty. Like most console gamers in the early 2000s, my first introduction to the series was Call of Duty Finest Hour. I remember first renting it from Blockbuster or Hollywood Video on the Xbox, but I eventually picked it up for the PS2. Finest Hour is different from the original Call of Duty, but was still an excellent introduction to the series for console gamers. It is still my favorite Call of Duty single-player campaign, and Big Red 1, another console-only offshoot, was also a great Call of Duty game. In 2002, EA Games released Medal of Honor Allied Assault and Medal of Honor Frontline, both of which featured an epic Omaha Beach scene that blew everybody's mind at the time. For PS2 gamers excited to see how popular PS1 franchises would make the next-gen jump to the PS2, taking advantage of more powerful hardware which allowed developers to finally reach their full visions in game design that weren't possible with the constraints of the previous generation hardware. This was an incredibly exciting time. After the epic Omaha Beach opener, Frontline would then become more like the earlier games, going more into the OSS mythos of World War II, becoming more like James Bond than Saving Private Ryan in the missions that followed. It became more of a spy action game than an epic war set-piece game. I've always said that Call of Duty took the Omaha Beach scene in Medal of Honor Frontline and made an entire game out of it. Instead of going into the mythos of the war, it focused on the large-scale battles and epic set pieces, telling the story through the eyes of multiple soldiers from the Russian, American, and British forces. This allows the game to zoom out and view the war as a whole, and then zoom back in to tell the story of individual soldiers who partook in the biggest battles of the European War. Call of Duty 2 goes from the Battle of Moscow to Stalingrad to Monte Casualties forces in North Africa to D-Day and more, telling a much larger story through the eyes of each individual Allied soldier. Honestly, I appreciate the storytelling in the early Call of Duty games as it pays respects to Allied soldiers on multiple fronts who fought in the war. It's a whole lot less Hollywood movie, even if there is an obvious influence of movies in the design, and a whole lot more historical documentary in nature. While later Call of Duty games would be like theme park rides having epic set pieces that were trying to out-epic the epicness of the previous epic set pieces in the previous games. Call of Duty 2's epic set pieces are based on the monumental undertakings that were actual World War II battles. Is there a little Hollywooding in the designs to keep the game interesting for the player? Absolutely. But I still appreciate the low-key storytelling in Call of Duty 2 that ends up being more impactful, leaving the bulk of the storytelling to reading journal entries on the load screens and letting history tell the rest. I can't blame Infinity Ward for changing the story format after Modern Warfare became the monumental money-printing success that helped set the tone for the entire 7th generation to the modern era. Even if I quickly burnt out of the formula, most gamers' introduction to that formula came from Modern Warfare, so it was fresh and revolutionary to them. If you want to describe the PS360 experience with one game, it's Modern Warfare. That part I can't deny and can give respect to the franchise for being such a massive success, causing so many developers and franchises to follow suit, creating their own little Modern Warfare clones, just never as good, trying to get on that cash cow while they could. So while I may call it mediocre warfare, I forget that not everyone was as versed in all the pre-Call of Duty 4 first-person shooter cliches as I was. For the average gamer, it was a fresh experience, even if its tropes were already played out in 2007 when it hit. And plus, we all know it's really the online gameplay that made this series such a hit thanks to the perk system, allowing players to gain experience for their performance in each match to unlock new weapons and perks in the game, as well as get various kill streak abilities, like having a helicopter come in and give players free kills. The ingenious idea of adding a hint of RPG leveling to the online gameplay revolutionized online gaming. I remember that Big Red 1 had kind of a basic kill streak system where players could get various perks for gaining rank in each match, and looking into it, the United Offensive expansion pack for the original Call of Duty first introduced the idea. Modern Warfare, however, took that idea and expanded it into an integral online gameplay mechanic, making the already fun online gameplay into an incredibly addictive experience. It was a great idea and it revolutionized online deathmatch gameplay, helping transform Call of Duty beyond being just a popular franchise and into a cultural phenomenon. I did play Call of Duty 2 online here and there back in the day, and it was a fun game to play online. So Modern Warfare had a solid online formula already as a base to revolutionize online gaming with the addition of perks, and even the sprint button, which will be sorely missed should you go back and play the earlier games in the series. Not having Xbox Live for around 14 years, I haven't played Call of Duty 2 online in a very long time, but I always had fun with it when I would jump on. As an Xbox 360 launch game, this would have been the best next-gen game to play online for those who got the system at launch. Granted, who am I kidding? We all know that launch 360 owners were still just playing Halo 2 online, and maybe occasionally playing Call of Duty 2 or Perfect Dark Zero if they wanted to play one of those pretty next-generation games using their standard def televisions where the graphics were still mind-blowing for the time. For launch 360 owners who wanted to play a competitive first-person shooter online, Call of Duty 2 would have been the best choice at that time, edging out Quake 4, which I love, but whose brutal for the new player deathmatch wouldn't have appealed to a lot of mainstream gamers, and Perfect Dark, which had a decent online mode from what I remember to become the best online first-person shooter to play at launch. Chances are if you were playing the 360 online at launch, you were probably playing Call of Duty 2. In between Halo 2 matches, that is. I first picked up the Game of the Year edition of Call of Duty 2 on January 4th, 2008 at 8:51 p.m. I picked it up alongside Pikmin and Wave Race Blue Storm on the GameCube. I'm not telling you this because I have an immaculate memory or anything, or because it was a special date. I actually just left the Game Crazy receipt in the case to serve as a time capsule. I totally got Pikmin for $10, so heck yeah. I didn't get my Xbox 360 at launch. In fact, I didn't even directly buy the system at all. I had a friend who was getting a job at Best Buy around 2005. This friend asked to borrow money from me so he could get work clothes and some new shoes. So what did this goober end up asking for? Well, he asked to borrow $400. This is a close friend, still is to this day, and I knew where he they lived. This goober, and I'll show him this video sometime for laughs, ended up buying an $80 pair of DC skate shoes as work shoes. Fast forward to later, sometime in 2006, my friend who still owed me $400, mind you, picked up an Xbox 360. I remember going with him right after he got the system to one of his coworkers' apartments so they could play Madden on it to play test the system. Like, really, yeah, Madden. That was like his main reason for buying the system. As time went on, I would constantly go hang out over at my friend's house and play his Xbox 360, the only game he owned at the time being Dead Rising. I played the crap out of that game every time I was at his place. I eventually beat the game a couple of times and had a super leveled up character. When Gears of War hit, he asked me if I wanted to play a new game on the 360, which he wasn't using at the time. I said yes, so he traded in Dead Rising and purchased Gears of War. It didn't take long before he finally asked me the question I knew was coming. Hey, since I owe you that $400 and I'm not using my Xbox 360 and you seem to like it, do you want to just take my Xbox 360 and call it square? I said yes, and for $400 I got an Xbox 360 Pro with a copy of Gears of War. He's still a great friend, my lone surviving friend from high school. Just don't ever lend him any money. So while I didn't get an Xbox 360 at launch, I did go back and play the bigger launch games I missed, including Call of Duty 2. I had previously won Call of Duty 4 on the PC from a GamePro.com sweepstakes, so I had already been enjoying the absurdity of 40-player online deathmatches in the PC version. For me, going back to play Call of Duty 2 felt like a great return to form to Finest Hour and Big Red 1. I was really struck by the fact that there are a lot of open scenes in this game. Even though there are tunnel sections that see the player being forced down a large tunnel to progress, I never felt like I was being forcefully yanked through the game, constantly being bugged by the developers to keep following a narrow predetermined path that lead the player by the hand-designed philosophy this series would later be known for. There were some scenes in the game like that, but overall there were a lot of open areas, specifically in the American campaign where at times you are actually given a choice of what objective to clear next. There is a scene that sees the player being brought to an open village with multiple houses to clear of German soldiers. Instead of the game saying go here first, then clear here next, then go here after that, the player is given a choice of which house they want to clear first and the subsequent order they want to clear after that. It's an open battlefield feel. Well, not truly open in an open world sense, but the developers present you with a level and then get out of your way and let you play it as you see fit, and not just how they planned for you to play it. This scene really did put me into the shoes of an American soldier, dealing with the difficulties of house-to-house fighting that was so common during the war. It was also a breath of fresh air to play a Call of Duty game that backed off of the scripting and let me choose where I wanted to go next instead of feeling forced down the path every second of the game. For once, I didn't feel like a simple observer of the game playing itself while occasionally giving me the choice to shoot at enemies here and there. I actually felt like an active participant in the battle. Honestly, I forgot how good it feels to play a Call of Duty game that actually leaves some things up to the player, allowing some choice instead of just telling the player how they're going to play the scene. Infinity Ward let players choose how they were going to tackle the objectives themselves. It felt a lot more like what I was doing actually mattered in these open areas. There are still scripted set pieces in the game, but Call of Duty 2 has a great balance of scripted scenes and scenes that leave it up to the player to choose their own plan of progression. They really got that delicate balance of player choice and scripting down. I remember thinking to myself, I forgot how much I liked this game single player while playing through this game again. It really is a throwback to the fact that Infinity Ward was capable of designing games that didn't feel so forced all the time. On top of the regular on-foot levels, there is a tank scene and a couple of scenes where you call in artillery strikes on tanks and attacking enemy soldiers. But not much for overdone theatrics, as the missions the game recreates were already dramatic struggles without having to Hollywood things up much. The actual historical events of the war were dramatic enough, like the Battle of Stalingrad and the D-Day mission where the US Army Rangers scaled the cliffs of Puente du Hoc, while under fire from the Wehrmacht defenders on top. This is one of the most memorable missions of the game and one of the most insane missions of the entire war. This actually happened. As it has been documented, the Germans had actually moved the guns inland to avoid their being destroyed by Allied bombing. So the assaulting Ranger forces found only decoys at the top, having to search further inland before finally finding and destroying them. If you played through this game years ago and remember nothing else about it, there's a good chance you remember this mission. I remember seeing it in previews of the game before the 360 even released. I played the bulk of this footage on an Xbox One, so the gameplay experience was extra smooth feeling. Backwards compatibility is definitely the best way to play the Xbox 360 version of the game. When playing on an actual Xbox 360, the experience is also pretty smooth smooth overall, with some frame rate dips, especially when using smoke grenades. As a launch game, some dips here and there are to be expected. If there's one thing I cannot criticize about the entire Call of Duty series, it's the movement and aiming mechanics. Call of Duty 2 has that unmistakable Call of Duty feel in movement and aiming, minus the later added sprint mechanic. That's really the only knock against going back and playing the earlier games in the series, not having the sprint mechanic. The rest of the movement and aiming feel is classic Call of Duty, so it adds to the smooth feel of the game. The gameplay mechanics are smooth and the design also feels a lot more open, making it feel like you have a lot more choice. While there are still invisible barriers and even conveniently placed minefields to keep players within the confines of the playfield, the game feels a lot more open in its design. There are still the old played out, "Hey you, go put this bomb on that tank," or "Go put that bomb on the door, go do this, go do that" design elements, but it was obviously a way to try and put the player into the shoes of a World War II soldier. This style of giving out objectives would later be played to death in all future Call of Duty games and in the vast majority of 7th gen first and third person shooters as well. However, in Call of Duty 2 they feel a lot less forced. Maybe it's because they don't beat you to death by repeating the same objective every 2 seconds because you dare to explore the level a little more or do things like gather ammo for 30 seconds. Sometimes they don't even repeat the objective. The low-key nature in which they use the "Hey you" commands in the game was a breath of fresh air. The "Hey yous" are still there, but not obnoxiously there in hand-holding fashion that later games would adopt. The friendly AI squad mates in the game are very good at walking into your line of fire and not much else. They aren't particularly helpful in the least, and oftentimes will just wait outside a building as you single-handedly clear it by yourself. The enemy AI, on the other hand, is very good. I only played this on the medium difficulty for this playthrough, and at that difficulty there's nothing particularly hard about the game. I did die a number of times, however on harder difficulties, the enemy AI is psychically good. And yes, they all are shooting at you. On the easier difficulties they will engage your AI squad mates a little, but I remember playing through this game on veteran difficulty, or at least playing through a portion of it years ago, and on that difficulty any and all illusions that the enemy AI isn't just only shooting at you goes out the window. You can see hints of this when it comes to the MG42 nests, which tend to focus their fire on the player if they so much as peek out from behind cover. It's not realistic, but it's a game, and at least the enemy AI makes for a good challenge. Sometimes a little bit too good of a challenge if you ask me. I know that World War II first-person shooters eventually did start to wear out, hitting it strong with Medal of Honor in 1999 and becoming a popular fad for years to come. However, if you were worn out of the World War II theme, coming back to a game like Call of Duty 2 will be a great reminder as to why they were so popular to begin with. I don't know if it's the historical aspect of the game or the World War II era firearms you use in the game, but at times I could visualize being that soldier, defending a building from attacking soldiers, or making a tactical retreat to defend a position until reinforcements show up. A game is a game, and it hardly compares to what soldiers actually went through, but it really does spark the imagination, making you wonder what would I have done if I was actually there. Knowing my luck, I would have been the first to die. But I did find myself getting into a groove, doing things like going light on the trigger on the BAR, shooting bursts of fire instead of dumping the whole mag. I would also find myself searching out the Garand, the Nagant, or the small magazine Lee Enfield rifle to have the common soldier rifle to use in the game. Granted, that wasn't always the case, as I would usually run out of ammo and just have to pick up the MP40. The pacing of the game means that you're more likely to pick up the submachine guns, as they are more effective for clearing the massive enemies that come your way. I generally like to have a submachine gun and a long-range rifle, whether it be a bolt action or something like the Tokarov. As a launch game, the graphics were an excellent showing for the system, but as you may expect, aren't the most detailed the system would see. For a launch game, it looks great and runs well. The sheer size and scope of the game was impressive and felt pretty epic at the time. The jump from PS1 Medal of Honor to PS2 Medal of Honor was drastic, and the jump from PS2 era Call of Duty to Xbox 360 era Call of Duty was also pretty drastic by comparison. The areas of operation were even bigger. The ability to throw more enemies at the player made for an impressive generational jump. While the jump wasn't as dramatic as that jump from PS1 to PS2, the ability to have larger battlefields with more enemies attacking was still impressive and made for quite a bit more intensity, making for an experience that was probably more true to history and presentation. This game was graphically impressive impressive for the time, and looked great even on the standard def televisions that most of us had at the time. The only graphical complaint I have is that it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between friendly soldiers and the enemy. This could be the case of me just being blind and accidentally shooting a friendly in the heat of battle, but there were times I could swear an enemy was running at me only to find out I accidentally killed a friendly, and sometimes that can end your game. The symphonic music composed by Graham Revell is excellent and really fits the epic and historic feel of the game, bringing in shades of Hollywood movies and historical documentaries made about the war. The voice acting is well done, but the gun sounds sound a bit paltry. Most games don't accurately portray firearm sounds, and they are hard to get an accurate recording of. This is true of a lot of war games or just games in general. The gun sounds aren't horrible, about par for the course at the time. The bottom line, Call of Duty 2 was an excellent first showing for the Xbox 360. This was a must-play launch game. It had excellent, for the time, next-gen graphics and an epic scope, excellent online play, and some really thoughtful design put into it. Coming back to play this game was a breath of fresh air when it comes to Call of Duty single-player modes. I really enjoyed the less hand-holding nature of the game. Allowing the player freedom is a throwback to just how talented Infinity Ward was with game design before they created Modern Warfare, which would become the game design template for the entire 7th gen. I know I am very critical of Call of Duty single-player modes, as I started to burn out of modern gaming in the 7th gen, and Call of Duty design elements were a huge contributing factor to my burnout. However, I really enjoyed my time with Call of Duty 2 while playing it for this review. Modern Warfare and After might be the undisputed kings of the online multiplayer aspects of the series, but for the single-player campaigns, the earlier games are still the best in the series. I love Finest Hour, I love Big Red 1, and I love Call of Duty 2. And if you're interested in going back and playing Call of Duty 2, it is backwards compatible on the Xbox One and Series X. And of course there's the vastly superior PC version, right, PC gamers? That's available on Steam for about $20. I still say it's worth going back and at least playing. In fact, I want to actually go back eventually and get the original PC version of Call of Duty, just because I have yet to play it. The rest of the series I'm not so keen on in the single player, but again, the earlier games in the series are definitely worth going back to play. I was playing some Golden Hornet last night, and this game is just fun. I can't beat level 4-2, I just keep dying. So in all openness, I haven't beaten this game yet, because I'm terrible at all old arcade games. One day I was on Steam, and I had some money left in my Steam wallet, and I was jonesing for some good old Robotron 2084 twin-stick action. After typing Robotron into the Steam search bar, I was incredibly disappointed to see that, alas, there still isn't a Robotron port on Steam. However, another game piqued my interest. It was called Frantic Dimension, and it was a combination of Berserk with Robotron 2084 twin-stick controls for movement and shooting. The Steam page gives you the option to download the demo version, basically the full game for free, or to drop 99 cents to buy the game. I paid my 99 cents and was just blown away by Frantic Dimension. I was, and still am, awful at the game, but what really struck me about the game is I could tell the designer had a passion for 80s arcade games. There are a ton of retro throwbacks that get so caught up in making a game that has the retro aesthetics, they forget to design an actual retro game. It's more like they design a modern game with retro graphics, where they sometimes just feel, to me, soulless in their designs. You can make, say, a retro platformer that looks like an N64 game or a Super NES side-scroller, and still completely mess up the gameplay feel and nuanced level designs that made the games they are imitating so good. Frantic Dimension not only has the aesthetics down, but from a gameplay aspect, this game could easily pass for a 1984 arcade hit. Hijong Park, or Hijon Park, sorry if I slaughtered that, I'll just refer to the creator as Park from now on, appears to be the solo game developer behind Frantic Dimension and Golden Hornet, and is a person that you can tell not only has a deep passion for retro twin-stick shooters and arcade games in general, they also nailed the gameplay and design aspects that made those games so good, while improving upon the formula and creating games that could easily pass for authentic 80s arcade games. Not all of their games are twin-stick shooters, for example Phantasma, which is blatantly Defender, but all three of the games from this developer I've played so far are excellent. Golden Hornet takes a game like Choplifter, but adds Robotron-esque twin-stick shooter controls for a combination that just works amazingly. This game is so fun. The combo just works so well. Golden Hornet offers a simple arcade mode where the challenge is to rescue the required amount of hostages while fighting off enemy hordes. The number of hostages you have to rescue in each level increases per level, as do the amount of enemies that swarm you, making for some truly hectic fun. The arcade mode is a blast. I can't get very far into it, but I have fun every time I try it. The campaign mode is the level-based mode where players are challenged with completing specific objectives in each level. It starts out simple with missions where your only goal is to rescue a set amount of hostages, but quickly adds new objectives like rescue that set amount of hostages and destroy a specific set of enemies in the level. The levels get more complicated as you progress and quickly become mazes that require careful maneuvering, avoiding obstacles like laser beams and fireballs that shoot out of lava while trying to rescue hostages, taking a helicopter load back to the landing pad each time, similar to Choplifter. The levels and mazes are filled with tons of enemies, each with their own strategy to dispatch. Along the way, alongside your normal machine guns, you pick up various special weapons like missiles and ground-clearing bombs to help you fight the hordes of baddies that swarm you. When you turn the Hornet to face the ground and pull the trigger buttons on the Xbox One controller I was using, the Hornet will drop bombs on ground enemies. When turned facing left or right, the Hornet will shoot two types of missiles depending on which trigger you pull. I couldn't get my PS4 controller to work on the game, but it does support the Xbox One controller well. When playing on a keyboard, it's WASD to move and the arrow keys for directional shooting. I prefer the controller for this game personally, but the keyboard option is there if you want it. Graphically, the game looks authentic to an 80s arcade game. It moves super fast and runs so smoothly. The sound effects also sound authentic to the games it throws back to. You can tell this and all the other games Park has developed are true passion projects. When I get another Steam card, I plan on picking up the rest of the games the developer has developed. You can get them all for around $7, and they're definitely worth the money. Bottom line, the Golden Hornet is an excellent mixture of Choplifter and Robotron 2084. I am terrible at games like this, but this is a retro throwback that just nails everything we love about old 80s arcade games. This is a true passion project on the developer's part, and for 99 cents each, you won't find better 80s arcade throwbacks than the ones Park has developed. You could literally trick someone telling them that this was your favorite arcade game from 1983 and they wouldn't know the difference. It feels that authentic, and beyond just being a throwback, it's a super fun game for people who love gaming in all generations. This is an excellent game, and if you love retro games, I also suggest picking up all the games this developer has developed. Park has recaptured the essence of the games being thrown back to masterfully. Just a little over $7 to play some of the best 80s retro arcade throwbacks on the market today. I wholeheartedly suggest you just look into these games, play them, enjoy them, and throw 99 cents to the developer and publisher so we see more games like these. The original Killzone was one of my favorite first-person shooters on the PS2. It was initially hyped as a Halo killer and was rushed to beat the release of Halo 2 to the market, causing the game to be shipped in a mostly finished state. There were quite a few technical issues and glitches in the game, causing it to receive low to average review scores and be ridiculed all around. While there are quite a few first-person shooters on the PS2 I like better, I found that if you can get past the technical issues and adjust the controls, you'll find a shooter with its own kind of intensity in its gunfights, and a really unique World War II meets sci-fi atmosphere. It also had some decent online play, even if the online options were limited, and the game usually devolved into people grabbing the explosive weapon or just cooking grenades to blow up their opponents for quick kills. Killzone was a decent secondary online PS2 game to play for those times whenever you got tired of SOCOM, Battlefield 2, or for me, Delta Force Black Hawk Down. Overall, the original was flawed for sure, but solid if you can get past its glitches. It certainly wasn't a Halo killer. It wasn't even trying to be Halo. Do you remember when the developers of Amped, the launch game for the original Xbox, got caught using a Photoshop lens flare in their screenshots prior to the Xbox's release? No? I guess you don't, as I'm probably the only person who has thought of this in the last decade. There was some controversy over the screenshots at the time, as if they were trying to lie about the graphical capabilities of the Xbox. Welp. As it's been infamously documented, Sony said, "Hold my beer, here's a Killzone 2 trailer," at their 2005 E3 press conference after a long-winded presentation about the still yet to be revealed PS3 system's hardware. Attendees were then shown tech demos like the one of Unreal 3 engine running on the system. However, the Killzone 2 demo stole the show for those hungry to finally see the system's graphical capabilities. Very quickly, gamers and the gaming press were quick to question whether or not it was a pre-rendered cutscene or actual in-game footage. As it turns out, they were right to be suspicious, as it was later revealed to be CGI, which is one of the many early embarrassments for Sony when it came to the PS3. They got caught lying, even if they later tried to pass it off as a mock-up for what the game is going to look like. It would be 2 whole years before Killzone 2 would resurface with an actual in-game trailer at E3 2007, where it was clear that Guerrilla Games had been programming their fingers to the bone in order to make the final game look as good as that mock-up trailer from 2005 as possible. In fact, it was that fake trailer that kept the game on everyone's radar. As IGN put it, without that target video, would many people have really shown that much interest in Killzone 2, the sequel to a PS2 game that was hugely hyped, but wound up under-delivering? No, it was the target video that stoked the flames of interest, convincing those in attendance at the press conference for a brief, shining moment that Killzone 2 could be a major contender. Sure, it all came crashing down soon after, but the point is, from that moment on, Killzone 2 became a symbol of Sony's hype machine. Whether you wanted to take vicarious pleasure in Sony and Guerrilla Games failing to live up to the pre-rendered vision of the game, or you were clinging to the hope that they'd come through with the goods, Killzone 2 was well and truly on everyone's radar. The game would finally hit in February 2009 and was another great exclusive for the PS3, which was still trying to catch up to the Xbox 360 in sales. After an incredibly rocky start, the 360 had a better online service, gamer score, a year head start, a cheaper price, and most third-party games ran and looked better on the 360. That is, if the system was actually working to run them, making the early years of the 7th gen console war a rough one for Sony. If you frequented online gaming sites or message boards, the first few years of the PS3 were all doom and gloom. It didn't help that this was the time where gaming magazines were dying, and from my experience, the online outlets became very sensationalistic for clicks. Negativity gets clicks, and I remember seeing a ton of articles stoking the fanboy flame war drama of the day. I'm absolutely not saying that Sony didn't deserve some of the negative coverage, releasing a $600 machine that, from the evidence of multi-platform games, wasn't the more powerful system that the rabid Sony fanboys swore up and down it was. Most third-party developers had a lot of trouble developing PS3 games thanks to the complexity of the cell processor in the system, so the average third-party developer didn't have the time or the money to devote to learning how to get more out of the system. They just ported their games in the traditional manner, using the cell processor as a traditional CPU and using the RSX to handle the graphics. It didn't help that Sony wasn't being very helpful with their development tools given to the third-party developers either. Insomniac Games eventually stepped up and started a tech-sharing initiative called Nocturnal, where they would share elements of their source code with other prospective PS3 developers to help those struggling with PS3 development get a leg up on developing for the system. In the first couple of years of the PS3's life, it really couldn't compete with the 360, which had a better online service, gamer score, and big-name games like Halo 3, COD 4, and Gears of War. If you were an online gamer, and most of us were at the time, looking for the best competitive games online, the 360 was where it was at. Games like Resistance, Fallen Man, and Warhawk were fun and definitely worth playing online, but they didn't have the same MLG professional gamer coolness factor that Halo 3 had. Call of Duty 4 was also on the PS3, but it didn't have the later implemented trophy support. It still doesn't to this day. Nor did Sony's online service make it as easy to maintain that social aspect, lacking the cross-game party chat feature of Xbox Live. The 360 was cheaper, had better online features, a better GPU which made for better looking and better running third-party games, big-name franchises, more games, a larger install base, was able to swipe up big-name franchises like GTA 4 and Final Fantasy 13, and was the better system to own at the time for the average gamer, even if they sold us all a broken system with a massive failure rate. Yeah, they would eventually replace the systems for free, but you had to call them up, and I didn't even get the infamous 360 coffin sent to me. I had to package it and mail it myself, and then I went without the system until it was shipped back to me. I don't even remember how long it took for them to get me the system back, but it was long enough. By the time 2009 came around, the PS3 had slowly and surely become a system with a great library of exclusive titles. Sony's first and second party developers had stepped up to create some of the most memorable exclusive franchises for the system, taking advantage of the power of the cell, as snarky 360 fanboys of the day would sarcastically repeat. What a fun and kind of scary generation of fanboy flame wars. The biggest exclusive of the early PS3 had released in Metal Gear Solid 4. Chances are, if you were an early adopter of the PS3, like the early adopters of the PS2 who bought it with anticipation of Metal Gear Solid 2, you bought a PS3 almost exclusively for Metal Gear Solid 4, playing the earlier offerings of the PS3 as an appetizer to the main course. The release of Metal Gear Solid 4 was a huge event for PS3 gamers at the time, and it was the biggest exclusive for the system that wasn't going to come to the Xbox 360. Well, I guess an R&D team at Konami did eventually get it running on a 360 dev kit, but Konami never went any further on the project. Ever since the 2007 E3 trailer of Killzone 2 hit, PS3 fans and diehard fanboys alike were salivating over the game, while there was still a lot of cynicism about how the game would turn out thanks to the so-so scores of the previous Killzone games and other middling efforts from Guerrilla like Shellshock. Gamers were still hyped for this game, some foolishly touting it as a Halo 3 killer. Again, nonetheless, even if Metal Gear Solid 4 was the biggest PS3 event, Killzone 2's release just a couple of months after Resistance 2 was yet another exciting event in that period of time for PS3 owners. I guess Resident Evil 5 also came out around that time as well, but I couldn't care less about that game personally. I didn't get my PS3 until later that year in 2009, so I didn't get to partake in the launch of Killzone 2, but I remember the excitement for the game on the GamePro.com forums I frequented. PS3 fans and fanboys alike were incredibly hyped for this game. Resistance 2 had come out a few months prior, so the fanboys in particular had more ammunition to fling at their 360 fanboy foes to prove the power of the cell. Resistance 2, which is a game that I personally wanted to like more than I actually did when I finally played it despite loving the original, and Killzone 2 were a great 1-2 punch for those fanboy flame wars, and any outlet that dared review them lower than perfect was bought by Microsoft. For me, Resistance 2 was a bit of a letdown in the single player. I got to an annoying boss and then I just quit playing it. I can't even fully remember if I ever played its chaotic 60-player online matches or its online co-op modes. Killzone 2, by comparison, I did enjoy, even if it wasn't as good as the fanboy hype machine made it out to be. Killzone 2 was definitely a visual tour de force on the PS3. Guerrilla used the 4 years of development to take advantage of the complexity of the cell processor, getting down into the bare metal of the system and using deferred rendering and post-processing effects to produce a visually stunning game, getting it as close as they could to the quality of the 2005 trailer. I remember the PS3 fanboys on the GamePro.com forums I frequented declaring the graphical debate between the PS3 and 360 as over after Killzone 2 release. The power of the cell had finally been tapped, and the plebeians who clung to their Xbox 3 fix-me's would never have a game as beautiful as Killzone 2. 3 fix-me fanboys would respond by calling the game Gray Zone or Brown Zone, saying they could only get performance out of the system if they used washed-out color palettes. Killzone 3 would later prove this wrong, but sitting back and seeing the fanboy flame wars of that day was actually pretty fun, to say the very least. The modern fanboy flame wars are pretty lame by comparison. Ooh, Starfield versus Spider-Man 2, who cares? The visual spectacle of Killzone 2 did come at a price in the aiming controls, which feel delayed and heavy. Even on the highest setting, the aim is sluggish feeling. Killzone 3 would later fix the aiming issues, causing Killzone 2 fans to complain about having fixed controls, to which I still wonder why that would ever be a complaint. Oh my gosh, they fixed the laggy controls. How dare they make aiming more responsive and accurate because they found a way to improve the engine to where it didn't have to handicap the aiming to keep the frame rate from dipping too low reload from fast aiming. Those jerks, I tell you, how dare they, the audacity. Taking place 2 years after the events of the original game, which saw the Helghast Horde invading the peaceful planet of Vecta, it is now time for the Interplanetary Strategic Alliance, ISA for short, to take the fight back to the Helghast on their home planet of Helgen. You play as Sev, a battle-hardened ISA soldier whose goal is to capture the Emperor Visari, the leader of the Helghast. At its core, Killzone 2 is a great example of a 7th gen shooter, filled with all kinds of 7th gen shooter cliches. Regenerative health, teammates you have to revive all the time, overly scripted set pieces abound in the game. You have the annoying Sev, hey Sev, go do this fetch quest in the middle of battle, a turret scene I've always hated, cover me while I hack this door, and even good old King of the Hill where you defend a position from a Helghast onslaught. Killzone isn't the Halo 3 killer PS3 fanboys were hoping for. It's actually a lot more like Kill of Duty than it is like Halo 3. That being said, 13 or 14 years removed from playing through this campaign last, I have a higher tolerance for the played out cliches in 7th gen shooters, even if I found all the boss fights in the game to be obnoxiously annoying, but not nearly as obnoxious as those in Resistance 2. One of the later scenes in the game is actually pretty epic. Normally I roll my eyes at the try-hard epic set pieces in Call of Duty style games, but there is a scene that sees you fighting your way up to Visari's palace that was epic without the normal cookie cutter theatrics. No overdone theatrics, no overdone cinematics, just Sev and the rest of your team taking on what feels like an endless horde of Helghast, fighting hard to take every foot of ground you can. I really enjoyed this whole scene because it wasn't trying to be epic, yet by keeping it simple, it was epic. Just the player, their squad, and their guns and their wits, fighting forward on a large walkway or bridge, shoot, dodge, take cover, throw grenades, push forward to gain some ground, and then being pushed back by a Helghast onslaught and grenades. I found myself getting quiet and focusing on the task at hand. This scene feels a lot smoother and a lot less forced than similar scenes in other 7th gen shooters. It feels more organically epic without the normal added theatrics of the day. The devs just got out of your way and let you play the game, which I really enjoyed. The gunplay in the game feels great, aided by the awesome grenade cooking mechanic and the duck and cover system that Killzone 2 handles a little different than other duck and cover shooters, as it never leaves the first person view when you enter cover. Hitting the duck button on any surface that allows you to cover behind it sees Sev sticking to that surface, and players can poke their heads up to shoot at enemies either with the crosshairs or aiming down the sights. This gameplay mechanic becomes second nature in every gunfight, and adds a strategic element to the gunfights. If there is a more valid complaint other than they fix the aiming to make against Killzone 3, it's that it rarely affords the player the opportunity to use this feature. Killzone 2 uses this duck and cover mechanic better than any other Killzone game that followed it. The enemies in the game can be bullet sponges, but so can Sev. Unlike Resistance 2, where it felt like Nathan Hale would die if an enemy sneezed on him, Sev can take quite a bit of punishment before he succumbs to his wounds. I enjoy feeling more like a walking tank in a regenerative health first-person shooter than feeling like I have to hide every couple of seconds in a large battle. I think Killzone 2 got the balance of giving and receiving damage right. While the Doom Marine would still laugh at him for being such a wimp, Sev can still take quite a bit more damage than in a lot of other 7th gen shooters. I guess that's what the PS3 fanboys meant when they tried to justify the sluggish controls, because it helped add weight to your character. Overall, Killzone 2 is fun and I do enjoy it. It still contains a lot of the same design elements of every other mainstream 7th gen first-person shooter. Over-the-top set pieces, filler vehicle and turret scenes, fetch quests, and so many other cliche first-person shooter stereotypes that I was completely tired of only a couple of years into the 7th gen. Its strong gunplay, unique visuals, and atmosphere still make for a 7th gen shooter I would rather go back to and play over any Call of Duty single-player campaign. It has a lot of samey elements of popular mainstream shooters of its day, but it still has a unique enough gameplay style, art direction, and epic sound score to set it apart from all the Call of Duty clones of that generation. Some of my actual favorite shooters of that generation were completely overlooked and buried under the hype of bigger games. And like the original Killzone, Killzone 2 and even Killzone 3 aren't my outright favorite shooters on the PS3, but they are two of my favorite shooters of that generation as a whole. If you're interested in going back and playing Killzone 2 for nostalgic reasons, I can still say it's one heck of a ride to go back to and relive for the maybe 6 or so hours it takes to beat it. As with a lot of shooters of that generation, when developers were focused on developing both an in-depth single-player mode and an in-depth online mode, the single-player campaign lengths were shortened. Killzone 2 had a solid online deathmatch mode. I didn't put a ton of hours into it, my brother did though. Instead of fostering more of an individual on a team feel, the game catered to being more team focused. Players could choose classes like medic, engineer, spy, and etc., and team play was not only encouraged but pretty much required. Its online play was good, but its more team focus means you weren't going to see this game hosting epic MLG style 1v1s. It was more Team Fortress in approach than Halo. Success in the game required teamwork. The online servers are long gone, but like the other games in the series, at least on consoles as I can't speak for the handheld releases, Killzone 2 offers a solid bot deathmatch mode. If you never got to experience this game when it was online, the bot matches are a glimpse into how it actually played. I love bot deathmatches myself, and I appreciate the bot matches Guerrilla has seen fit to include in every Killzone game from the original on the PS2 to Shadowfall. While I think Killzone 2 is a great example of a mainstream 7th gen first-person shooter, it's not a perfect one. Outside of the fact that its design is derivative of other shooters, it was a product of its time. Most of the complaints I would wager about Killzone 2 were fixed in Killzone 3, like how the Hellgas rifle lacks the optics of the ISA rifle, making it less effective for long-range shots, and not nearly as effective as the SMG for short-range to medium attacks. I also remember missing the secondary fire functions of the original Killzone in Killzone 2, which once stripped of that satisfying shotgun blast, makes the Hellgas rifle even more generic. Generally, I only used it if there was nothing else. I also dislike how the game only lets you carry one actual rifle, and you can't get rid of your secondary revolver, so it knocks you down to carrying only 2 firearms. The boss fights are also multiple death, trial and error affairs. I forgot about one of them till I replayed this footage, but I remember dreading the final boss fight. On the normal difficulty, it was manageable but still annoying. I remember it being one of my least favorite completely cheap end boss fights of that generation. It just stuck in my mind as an annoying affair, but I found it a lot more manageable this time. I'm guessing I've played more annoying ones since, or maybe my 7th gen burnout made me hate it a lot more at the time. It's still an annoying fight, but at least it wasn't filled with a bunch of terrible quick time events like Turok was. What a terrible design idea. I remember on harder difficulties Rico being a completely useless liability during the ending sequence, constantly needing to be revived before going down again 2 seconds later. Your teammate AI is slightly smarter than they were in the original, but you'll miss the invincible AI teammates of the original Killzone, as the ones in Killzone 2 are constantly going down, requiring you to revive them, which makes them more of a liability on harder difficulties than a help. The 7th gen stereotype of bullets only count if a character is shot in a cutscene also applies here. You know, earlier when your teammate took a direct round from a tank's howitzer and you just zapped him back to life no problem? It means nothing if he gets shot in a cutscene. It's silly, but welcome to modern video game story designs. I know I sound a bit nitpicky with my complaints, and it's true. These are all small nitpicks that didn't stop me from enjoying the game overall. These are just my observations from playing through this game 13 or 14 years after I last played through it. Overall, the game looks great, plays well, and even the sluggish controls, which I adjusted to fairly quickly, didn't hamper my enjoyment of the game. The single player mode is worth playing through again, but it is pretty short, and basically leaves off with a to be continued. Graphically, the game is one of the best looking games of that generation, using as many tricks as possible to make a game that's art direction still makes it eye-catching to this day. This game is a testament that sometimes art direction is more important than raw rendering power. It also runs smoothly. It feels like butter. Slow butter in the aiming, but still butter. The only hitches that come from a technical perspective are these strange mid-level load sections where the game just just freezes up to load in the next section of the map. At first you'll fear that your PS3 just froze up, but nope, it's supposed to happen. Other than that, it's a pretty smooth experience, and the load screens have a cool 3D motion card effect on them that can be manipulated with the 6-axis controller. The load times can be lengthy, but are manageable overall. The controls, aside from the delayed aiming, also feel pretty smooth overall. There are some forced 6-axis things to do, and this is a click in the R3 button to aim down the sights kind of shooter. The cover system in the game also feels great to use. Not a lot of complaints to wager here. It doesn't take long to adjust to the sluggish aim, and the cooking grenade mechanic is twice as fast as it is in the original, and it's just awesome to use. The voice acting in the game is top notch, and the musical score is excellent. The Killzone theme is iconic. The rest of the music in the game is also well composed. The ISA rifle sounds a bit paltry, as do some of the other guns. That's another thing that Killzone 3 would rectify. Overall, the sound design is good, with the only nitpick being some of the firearm sounds. The bottom line. Even without the online play attached, Killzone 2 is still worth going back to play through. In fact, just hunt down the Killzone Trilogy collection to get all 3 on the PS3. I am a Killzone fan. I always have been, and while I've never found Killzone 2 to be that huge killer game that PS3 fanboys made it out to be, it's still unique enough from the average 7th gen first-person shooter to go back and experience, either for the first time or the first time in a while. Its visuals are some of the best the PS3 ever produced, and the atmosphere is amazing. The gunplay is well done, especially the duck and cover system. Its release was definitely a memorable event for PS3 owners at the time, and while it wasn't a Halo 3 killer, or Halo 2.5 according to the rabid PS3 fanboys, or even a huge killer app for the PS3, only selling about 2 million copies overall, it was a great exclusive for the system during a period of time when the system was really starting to gain some momentum, and see a lot of great exclusive games being released. Killzone 2 was another good reason to own a PS3, alongside Metal Gear Solid 4, Little Big Planet, Resistance, Uncharted, Ratchet & Clank, and other previous or future system-defining exclusive titles. 2009 was a great year for PS3 owners, starting the year strong with Killzone 2, and topping it off with games like Demon's Souls and Uncharted 2. And Killzone 2 is still worth playing. And since I only just got a PS4 recently, 10 years after the fact, I can say that I've also been enjoying Killzone Shadowfall. It took the series into a more open direction in its designs, encouraging more exploration, and making the battles feel more like smaller skirmishes as opposed to big over-the-top affairs. I like the more open direction Shadowfall took the series, even if it means that some of the environments are large and empty by comparison to the previous games, thanks to the exploration element. Right now I'm stuck on some forced stealth mission which I hate, but overall I like Shadowfall. It's almost like they said, let Call of Duty do the played out Call of Dutying, and we'll design something different, with a little fun bot to use too. Obviously the game was rushed for launch, but you can see how Guerrilla was exploring more open exploration in Killzone prior to Horizon, which I'm still playing through for the first time. Shadowfall is worth playing, and while I never got to experience it online before the servers were taken down, not that I would actually pay to play online, I do have a PC, thank you, which means I have no interest in ever getting PSN or Xbox Live, because online play should be free. It also has some fun bot death matches as well. If you have a PS4 or a PS5, if you want to play it at 60 frames per second, and have still yet to play Shadowfall, it's worth playing, and it has a cheap asking price to boot. To anyone versed in the epic fanboy flame wars of the 7th console generation, it takes only 2 names to send a shudder down their spine. 2 abysmal abominations released in an era where Sony was in desperate need of killer apps to justify the steep asking price of the PlayStation 3. 2 games that upon release gave Xbox 360 fanboys ammunition against their PS3 fanboy foes for years to come thanks to the abysmal scores these overhyped would-be killer apps received. Those 2 games in question are Lair and Haze. 2 games that, quite frankly, despite both being very flawed games, were a lot better than their review scores made them out to be, at least in my opinion. Like haze, Lair received a lot of pre-release hype. Again, both Sony and PS3 owners were hungry for great games to play, and forum fanboys needed ammunition to fling at their Gears of War playing and Halo 3 playing opponents. Lair hit before Halo 3, and despite the epic hype and huge anticipation by fans, came out to horrible review scores thanks to the poor design idea, either forced by Sony or chosen entirely by Factor 5 depending on who you ask, to make the game motion control only without the option to use the analog stick for flight and aiming controls. IGN gave this game a 4.9 out of 10 in a poorly written review, where upon reading it, the only conclusion I could come to is that in full Dean Takahashi fashion, it sounds like the reviewer, Greg Miller, wrote his entire review after he couldn't beat the 5th level of the game. The review literally only mentions that level and none of the later much harder levels. He complains about the targeting system in the game, which I agree with, and then touched on the story a bit while complaining about the controls the whole time. I guess he gave the game 1 point for every level he was actually able to beat. IGN wasn't alone in destroying this game. Most magazine publications and websites completely panned the game, with a few average to good scores thrown in there. The forced motion control scheme was too much for most gamers and reviewers at the time. When Factor 5 later released a patch to allow players to use the analog sticks to aim, the damage was already done, and Lair had already become an infamous bad game in the gaming zeitgeist of the day. The analog patch is still available on the PS3's PlayStation Store, and if you have any interest in ever playing Lair, I suggest you download it as soon as possible, because we all know time is ticking before Sony shuts down the PS3's PlayStation Store. I also suggest getting the Titan map pack for Unreal Tournament 3 if you ever want to take advantage of Unreal Tournament 3's mod support, which is the coolest yet still nearly forgotten feature on the PS3. I guess the reason I decided to review Lair first on this channel was to remind people that time is of the essence when it comes to getting the map packs and patches for PS3 games that you want to play. It's time to start downloading as many of these as you can before they are gone. For my first playthrough of Lair, I decided to play the entire game through using only the original motion control setup just to see what the original experience was like. After that, I went back and played random levels with the analog stick aiming enabled, and the analog aiming patch definitely improves the gameplay a lot. Without question, it was a huge mistake on Sony and Factor 5's fault not to include it day one. Lair had a rough development cycle. At first, there were a lot of good ideas that Factor 5 was planning to add to the game, and the game wasn't even going to resemble the final product we got. Long story short, in order to get something in a shippable form, they hunkered down and went with a trustworthy formula that had worked for them in the past. When it comes down to it, Lair is basically Rogue Leader with dragons. Learning the motion controls didn't take long, and the only time they became frustrating to use was in those bouts of slowdown that affected the aiming. The game in general doesn't run the best when played in 1080p mode. The slowdown doesn't affect the aiming all the time, but there were occasional periods where the aiming became almost impossible to use with the motion controls thanks to the frame rate dipping. Lair was meant to be a visual spectacle for the PS3, and as such the developers prioritized graphical fidelity over playability. I did manage to play through the entire game in 1080p, and most of this footage is in 1080p because I was focused on trying to make the game look as good as possible for this video. However, it does run a little better in 720p, which is what I suggest those looking for a more playable experience to play it at. In order to run the game in 720p, you have to go into your system settings and turn off 1080p and 1080i as options, as there is no option in the game to change it. That's just kind of how the PS3 worked. Oftentimes you'd have to shut off 720p in order to get it to display 1080p, whereas the Xbox 360 was a lot more user-friendly in this regard. Once I learned the controls, I actually started to really enjoy my time with Lair. It really does follow a solid formula established in the Rogue Squadron / Rogue Leader series. The missions are objective heavy, and some have very strict time limits leading to constant failures, but also that made me want to give a failed mission just one more try. Some of the later missions in particular feel twice as long as they should be, and dying or failing right before the end of these missions can demotivate you from wanting to give it another try. I definitely shut this game off a couple of times after nearly beating the Dead Man's Basin level, only to die or fail at the end, but I did find myself coming back within an hour or so to give it another try, finally beating it with a huge, satisfying sigh of relief and a pretty good shoulder workout from shaking the controller up and down as fast as I possibly could. But as in Rogue Leader, I did get better at playing each level as time went on, learning the patterns and seeing which objectives were more important to do first. The game will constantly pull you out of the action to show you a cutscene of a new objective or to show you how you are failing at the objectives. While I can understand this is done to add to the cinematic flair of the game, what it really amounts to is the feeling that every couple of seconds you're pulled out of the gameplay, and when you return to controlling your dragon, you have to quickly regain your bearings. This can be especially annoying if you're in the middle of lining up a shot at an enemy outpost that's destroying your ships, losing too many of which will lead to a mission over. Oftentimes, the interruptions led me to overshooting an enemy outpost and having to turn around while feeling excessive time pressure. The cinematic nature of the game can sometimes break the flow of the gameplay. I was also a little let down by the fact that most of the missions in the game were escort and protect type missions, and there wasn't much for straight up dogfighting in the game. Well, dragon fighting. Escort missions are some of my least favorite and some of the most frustrating mission types in any game. They even threw in a stealth mission for good measure and even a strange story mission where you have to hunt for water and then fight a giant bug to get to it. However, I was yearning for more dogfight style missions and more missions that made use of transferring to the ground to take out hordes of enemy soldiers. The ground fighting feature is a really fun mechanic that I wish they had expanded on. It's a cool idea and it's fun to land and kill hundreds of enemy peons. Eventually, new combos can be unlocked to unleash on the enemy hordes based on the medal system in the game, where you get graded by how you do in each level, similar to how they did it in Rogue Squadron. The dragon disarms are also pretty cool to see. When engaged, players are prompted into a QuickTime event to kill the enemy dragon and its rider. These are mildly entertaining and do add that cinematic flair the game is going for. You can disarm the enemy dragons or you can fight them in a fighting game minigame which has almost a rock, paper, scissors feel to it. There are some ideas at play that seem cool on paper and are mildly entertaining the first time, but probably should have been trimmed out of the game because they disrupt the gameplay flow. An example of this is how your dragon can pick up and fling an enemy foot soldier as the game pauses to watch the poor soul ragdolling across the map. The first time it's amusing, but after a while it becomes yet another thing to interrupt the game. The ability to pick up enemy foot soldiers also interrupts the targeting system, and as the IGN reviewer complained about, becomes a source of frustration when instead of targeting a mission objective, like a large rhino, your dragon swoops down to pick up a foot soldier instead, and the camera takes a disorienting position that makes it hard to even realize what just happened. Even after mastering the motion controls or playing with the analog sticks, the game has a few technical issues that aren't game-breaking by any means, but had they been ironed out would have improved the experience quite a bit more. The frame rate is an obvious issue, as is the targeting system, which when you get it to work properly can lead to some thrilling circling while firing on enemies. I wish they would have had time to rework the whole targeting system to a more workable form, where the camera cooperates better. There are plenty examples in prior games that got this function right for some truly excellent results. There are times in this game where you feel like you are fighting with the targeting system to get it to work just right. A little bit of extra tweaking in this area would have gone a long way. The camera can also freak out and be very disorienting at times, but not always. Generally it follows the action well, but it can be very wonky at other times. The physics system in the game also has its own peculiarity to it, where if your dragon comes too close to an object or an enemy dragon flies too close to your dragon, it bounces your dragon up and out of the way from it. It's almost like there is a physics force field around the objects in the game that can bounce your aim away in the other direction. This can be very frustrating when you're trying to aim at a specific target and your aim is shot upwards in a completely different direction because an enemy flew too close to you. This can also lead to some jank when you are locked onto something like a war beast and your dragon is stuck flying around the sides of a ridge and can't seem to just fly up and over it. There are times where I was trying with all my might while being locked on to turn left while my dragon being stuck following the side of a ridge is going right instead. The glitchy physics can also knock you out of a dragon duel because you ran into a wall, so the game cancelled it out, throwing you back into the game without notice. Another thing that at first seemed janky to me until I realized it was done on purpose but is never explained to you is in those scenes where your dragon has to latch onto something like, say, a generator, and you have to shake your controller rapidly up and down in order to destroy it. Getting shot by an enemy will knock you off the object you are attached to. At first I thought the game would just inconsistently let go of the object, when in actuality I was taking shots by surrounding foes. I have also, though I didn't get any footage of it, thrown foot soldiers through the map into the abyss that exists outside the game world. And all of that being said, despite quite a list of technical issues and glitches, I still really enjoyed my time in Lair overall. I wasn't a fan of the overwhelming amount of escort missions, but the more I played them, the better I got at them. It has that same difficulty curve as Rogue Leader, which is still one of my favorite GameCube games. The game can be tough and yet still very satisfying when you succeed, and not even the escort missions and sometimes unfair time limits kept me from enjoying the game, despite its flaws. As I stated, the formula in Lair is based on a sound one, and if you are a fan of Factor 5 Star Wars games, then you will probably find some enjoyment in Lair. It's definitely a more flawed version of the formula when compared to what came before, but I still found the game to be engaging enough to play all the way through it. It pulled me into its gameplay, and I enjoyed myself overall. The game is not without its share of frustrations and flaws. If you can get past the controls, or just download the analog aiming patch from PSN, and get past the glitches, you might find some enjoyment out of this infamous quote-unquote bad game. It is a shame that the game did so poorly in the reviews thanks mostly to the controls. It's also a shame that some of the technical issues weren't ironed out before release. But Factor 5 definitely put a lot of effort into this game, and however imperfect it is, this isn't a bad game. Out of the two terrible twins of the early PS3 games, I would say that Lair is definitely better than Haze. Even if I don't think Haze is that bad either, it was another game that had a lot of good ideas that just never quite came together before release. Free Radical should have also trimmed a lot of those good ideas on paper out and polished the gameplay more, cutting down on the large but empty feeling levels and getting the gunplay and AI better. Haze still has some fun bot deathmatches though, and the online was actually decent back in the day. I still like Haze even though it's horribly flawed, but maybe that's just because I've determined to like it. Graphically, Lair definitely nailed the epic scale and scope they were aiming for in the game. The only thing they didn't nail was the frame rate. Aiming for 1080p was a bit much for the PS3, but in early games, developers certainly didn't know the console's limits. It does play a little smoother at lower resolutions. The art direction is unique and the graphics were excellent for a first generation PS3 game. They also put a lot of effort into the story cutscenes. The story itself is pretty good, if predictable. No complaints with the voice acting either. If you're a story-based gamer as opposed to being a gameplay-based gamer like myself, there is something here for you as well. The orchestral musical score is amazing and fits the epic feel of the game perfectly. You can tell they spared no expense when it came to the game's soundtrack. The sound effects from the cries of enemy soldiers to the snarls of your dragon are also well done. There was a lot of care and effort put into the sound design of this game, and it shines through. The bottom line. Lair is definitely a flawed game that hit with a polarizing control scheme and various other technical glitches. However, this game is definitely a lot better than the reviews made it out to be. I don't give review scores, but this is a 7 out of 10 kind of game, give or take a point or half a point. The hype for the game was huge before it hit, filling a void in time where Sony desperately needed more killer apps for the PS3 to justify the system's price, and to convince more people to buy the system, which made its low review scores even more embarrassing for Sony at a time where they couldn't even buy good press if they wanted to. Well, they probably could have, but Microsoft could buy more negative press. Simply put, Lair was never going to be a killer app. Even if it released day one with analog stick control and all the technical glitches had been ironed out before release. Gaming had changed, and the days where a game like Rogue Leader could come in and be a killer app for the GameCube were long past. In just a few short years since the GameCube hit, mainstream tastes had changed, and the dawn of the online and digital era was upon us. Games had also jumped up from a $50 asking price to a $60 asking price, and we thought the future of strictly single-player games games was in question at that time. Outside of something like Grand Theft Auto or Oblivion, that is, Lair could be beaten in just a couple of hours, and its only online connectivity was leaderboards, which are still up to this day. People wanted Gears of War, Halo 3, and eventually Modern Warfare. Most traditional single-player games were all but ignored by the vast majority of gamers in the PS360 era. First-person shooters, predominantly modern shooters, and duck-and-cover third-person shooters with a heavy emphasis on online play dominated the generation. And unless it was a big-name franchise, most other traditional genres were put aside by gamers and developers. Whole genres and subgenres of games more or less died, even if they were a popular genre on the PS2 from the previous generation. I mean, even 3D platformers, which were immensely popular on the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, are only just now starting to recover from the 7th generation, where we were pretty much just down to Ratchet and Clank and Mario. 3D space or airplane flight games pretty much died outside of maybe Ace Combat and Tom Clancy's Hawks. Even once big-name games like Unreal Tournament 3 failed to do well enough to keep midway games from going out of business. Development costs at the time skyrocketed, and developers had to go with whatever popular tastes were at the time just to survive. Tons of great traditional style single-player games were ignored by the mainstream gamers, outside of maybe for weekend rentals. And Lair, being a single-player game with a single-player focus, even had it released in perfect form, wasn't going to sell systems. Not even better games that hit like Uncharted and Heavenly Sword, which came out later, were console sellers. Now, Grand Theft Auto 4 and Metal Gear Solid 4 were console-selling games with a predominantly single-player focus, but those were uber popular franchises. Lair, for those who can look past its flaws, is still worth playing. It definitely plays a lot better with the analog stick, so again, make sure if you have any interest in playing this game or replaying this game to get your PS3 online to the PlayStation Store and download the patch while it's still available, and the Titan Map Pack for Unreal Tournament 3 while you're at it. Even if you don't own the games, you can download the pack, and if you ever get the game, you can install it. This game is far from a 4 or 5 out of 10 kind of game. Looking back on what we know now, I actually truly doubt most of the reviewers ever beat the game before they even reviewed it. At its lowest, Lair is a 6, because it's still playable. It's really not that bad of a game, and it certainly wasn't worthy to be used as cannon fodder in online arguments. Haze, however, I can understand. But if Lair is the worst game you've ever played, you should probably play some more games. I was first introduced to the Munchables thanks to a video review on GamePro.com, which first piqued my interest in the game. I love quirky niche titles, and the GamePro editor's enthusiasm for this game won me over at a time when I had no interest in the Wii whatsoever, dismissing it as a shovelware system with a few good Nintendo-made games and a stupid control gimmick. I wasn't anti-Wii per se, I just didn't care about the system in the least, which was a common view that most traditional-style gamers took at that time. However, those traditional Nintendo titles, games like the Munchables, and even playing D-Blob with a friend's nephew at the time won me over to the system. When I finally picked up a Wii, the one that came with Mario Kart because you couldn't pay me money to actually care about Wii Sports, I made sure that the Munchables was one of the first games I picked up for the system. The Munchables, being developed by the same team as Katamari, takes the growth gameplay of Katamari Damacy, where rolling things up eventually grows your Katamari into a massive ball capable of gaining access to areas that were previously inaccessible, and puts an eating spin on the formula, where your main character, either Chompy or Munchie, grows bigger by eating enemies and gaining size levels until they are able to access new areas in each map. The once peaceful planet of Starveen has been invaded by Don Ungen and his diabolical army of space pirates who have stolen the Great Orbs, which would feed the Munchables, who are the planet's inhabitants. The Munchables, as the game's manual says, are greedy and hungry creatures. Now it's up to Chomper and Munchie to recapture the legendary orbs by eating as many of the invaders as possible. The Munchables is a testament to the fact that a game doesn't always have to be challenging to be an incredibly addictive experience. The Munchables, being aimed at children, is an easy game to beat. However, its gameplay and design is addictive enough to pull in gamers of all ages. The simple concept, yet fun gameplay will addictively draw in anyone no matter their age. This is a hard game to put down, whether you're 6 years old or 60, not to be played on an empty stomach. The core gameplay is simple. Players start as either Munchie or Chomper and eat enemies to gain levels and grow larger in size, which allows you to gain access to new parts of the level, usually blocked blocked by obstacles that can then be eaten once you gain the required level to do so. Larger enemies that are at a higher level than the player can be dash attacked to be broken up into smaller enemies that can be eaten. The levels end whenever you complete the final objective, which is usually stated at the beginning of each level. There are power-ups that can aid the player in eating more enemies, and also an exploration element where there are a set number of acorns hidden throughout the maps to be found, finding all of which unlocks a new accessory or clothing item basically. Some levels will throw in some additional objectives like hunting down and eating 20 ghosts in a haunted mansion, or finding and eating a set amount of statues. After you complete the lower levels in each area, you are then thrown into a boss fight against bosses like Broccoli or Rice Baller. Rinse and repeat this cycle 8 times and you beat the game, unlocking the mirror mode and a new character to play as. The bosses do have a little strategy to them, even if they are pretty much pushovers. And the game does a good job at explaining the boss strategy mid-game for those bosses where it's not instantly obvious on what to do. The final level even has a boss rush scenario, where you refight all the previous stage bosses before taking on the final boss, the King Pumpkin. Being only 8 levels long, the game is short, but the addictive gameplay always draws you in to play just one more level, meaning you will probably beat it very quickly. Once you beat the game, the mirrored mode is unlocked, which is a mode that, as the name suggests, mirrors the game maps, but adds a time limit to complete each level, acting like a time attack mode. Overall, the short length doesn't hamper the experience, because its addictive gameplay means that it's always fun to play through it again. Also, finding all the acorns and beating the time attack modes do give the game a little more length, if you're a completionist type gamer. Graphically, the game looks pretty good for a Wii game. It definitely fits the colorful, cutesy look of being a kid's game. The varied locales from a forest to a desert to even a haunted house are aesthetically pleasing, while the cutesy characters and objects in the game have that slight luminescent glow to them that was common in a lot of Wii games. Visually, by Wii standards, there isn't much to complain about here. The game looks and runs well overall. And while the game does feature some Wiimote waggling, it's put to a minimum here. The nunchuck is required for this game, and the only time you have to waggle is for jumping, and those occasions when you get hit by an enemy and have to waggle the controller to get back to normal. Flicking the Wiimote to jump is similar to the jumping mechanic in D-Blob, which I played before I played the Munchables. And while it's far from the most accurate way to handle jumping, it works okay, and feels a little bit more accurate in the Munchables than it does in D-Blob. For those who despise motion controls, they aren't overly implemented here, and everything else in the game from scarfing down enemies to the dash attack to the Z targeting feels natural to pull off. The music in the game is excellent. Some tracks are quirky, similar to the tunes in Katamari, and other tracks fit the atmospheric theme of the level, like the music in the haunted house. The tunes are well composed, and all around fit the cartoony aesthetic of the game. The sound effects from the dash attack to the chomping effect as you gobble up your enemies also fit the game well, and sound like stock cartoon effects. There's really nothing to nitpick here, unless you're a parent who's already fed up with quirky and annoying cartoon sounds. The bottom line. The Munchables may be derivative of Katamari, but it uses that same evergreen, always fun growth formula and is an incredibly addictive game that appeals to gamers of all ages. Don't let the fact that the game is aimed at kids dissuade you from enjoying this must-play Wii title. If you're collecting for the Wii, I wholeheartedly recommend putting the Munchables in your collection. Just don't play it on an empty stomach. I know it sounds strange to say, but at one time EA actually excelled at racing games. Long before they became a beacon of mediocrity and loot crates, EA was capable of making some incredibly fun and creative titles like Nascar Rumble. Nascar Rumble is what you'd get if you took Mario Kart, combined it with EA's yearly release NASCAR racing games, and added the shortcut-ridden tracks of Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit. NASCAR Rumble is a NASCAR take on the kart racing formula. This game isn't necessarily a kart racer, it's a stock kart racer. The The Mario Kart influence is obvious in Nascar Rumble. While you race, you can hit power-up icons which give you offensive weapons to fling at your foes. Ranging from the freeze, which freezes your steering in whatever position you were holding when it hit you. It has the typical oil slicks, which make your steering slippery. The Joker icon, which is a gamble that will either help you or hurt you, either giving you a power-up to fling at your opponents, or hitting you with bad gas or an oil slick. You have a better chance of getting something actually good out of an EA loot crate than you do of getting out of the Joker power-up, to things like the hammer and shockwave, where upon landing a hit send your opponents flying through the air. There's also a storm that blocks your view and messes with your steering capabilities, and a variety of others to be used against your unsuspecting foes, including the most epic and iconic power-up that is, rightfully, the most fondly remembered, the Tornado power-up, which allows you or your foes to send a devastating tornado up the track which sends everyone flying and tumbling through the air. Add in unlockables like new vehicles and tracks chock full of hidden shortcuts to find, and a great sense of speed onto all these satisfying power-ups, and you have the formula for one of the PS1's most fondly remembered alternative racers. This game is an outright blast to play. The name of the game in Nascar Rumble is Fast Fun Mayhem, where the kart racing, power-up racing, and sense of speed lead to some truly thrilling racing, where you are battling your foes while trying to hit all the shortcuts in each track. It's chaotic fun, where some races bog down into cars flying everywhere around the track as you navigate through, sometimes being caught into some spectacular crashes yourself. The triangle button is the reset button to put you back on the track, and you'll be pressing it a lot in this game. There's nothing quite like narrowly avoiding a tornado that is chasing behind you by ducking into a shortcut just off the main track. This game can be truly exhilarating in its racing. It can also get extremely crazy if you set the power-ups to mayhem, meaning there are extra power-up pickups in each map for the maximum amount of chaos possible. Power-up pickups can also be turned off or turned lower in the options menu. As in Mario Kart, you progress by beating 6 racing cups with 3 tracks each, with the option to play the Wild Card Cup, which has random tracks, and the EA Cup, which requires you to play through 6 races. Once you beat the main cups in the Rookie class, you unlock the Pro class, where the cars are faster and your AI opponents are tougher. Upon beating the same 6 in Pro class, you unlock the Elite class, where the cars are even faster and the AI opponents hit every shortcut and hit you with every power-up possible. The game's difficulty curve is gradual with each cup, but the Elite class opponents are total cheaters, able to catch up to you very quickly. There's nothing quite like getting hit with 3 storms in a row, then 2 tornadoes, a freeze, and then 2 opponents with hammers that catch up with you quickly. When this game cheats, it cheats good. You don't have to go it alone though, because the game lets you play the cups either by yourself or in a racing team with one other teammate who's either controlled by a second human player or an AI friend, which is actually a pretty cool idea, playing off the NASCAR theme, where NASCAR has teams. There is a ton of racing to be had if you plan on unlocking everything in the game. Not only do you have to play through the racing cups 3 times for each difficulty, there are 3 extra tracks to unlock, like the Circus Minimus track, which is best played on the Mayhem level of power-ups for the most hectic racing experience you'll probably ever have, or at least one of them. The Circus Minimus track can be completely insane, and it's super fun to play. On top of the 3 extra tracks to unlock, there are hidden areas in various maps that contain wrenches, collecting which unlocks a special vehicle like an RV, a golf cart, a rocket car, and etc. So not only are the maps honeycombed with hidden shortcuts, but those shortcuts have even more hidden areas to unlock new vehicles. This game has secrets within its secrets. There is a lot of racing and unlockables in the game. I guess you could technically always just put in a cheat code to unlock everything, but it's more satisfying to hunt down each secret on your own. Graphically, the game looks great by PS1 standards. It may not look like much on a modern display, but what looks like weird dithering if you're using a modern TV is actually blended on a CRT TV to give each car a glossy, freshly polished look. You can still see it a little on a modern display, but the effect makes the cars look like they have a glossy look on a CRT, which, as sad as it sounds, looked great for the time. The game also has a great sense of speed, even for a console as old as the PS1. Whether playing it on a PS3 like I am here, or on a PS2 like I am here, the game moves fast, which helps add to the feeling of chaos in the game. Even with 2-player split screen, it still has a good sense of speed. Looks like EA made some very wise cuts in the split screen mode in order to make it run as as good as it could. Overall, the game runs well, but the extra sense of speed does make the controls feel a little bit slippery and jittery overall. Granted, I do play this game with a D-pad because it just feels natural to me, not owning a proper DualShock until I got a PS3 later. This game is far from a sim racing game that would usually punish you for rubbing on the side of a wall, and it doesn't feel so much like you're turning around a corner then sliding around a corner. I generally found myself rubbing the wall in most turns, but without the normal punishment to my speed for doing so. There are times where clipping a wall can stop you in your place or even knock you backwards mid-race. Luckily, you have the fast reset button to use. The controls overall are responsive, if not a little slippery feeling. The engine sounds in the game sound great, as do the effects. The game does have an annoying, pointless announcer whose dialogue gets old pretty fast, but you can go into the options menu and mute him. The music consists of generic sounding southern rock style tracks, and is by default set too low to hear under the sounds of the engines. You can also turn the music volume up in the same options menu where you can mute the announcer. I usually just leave it at the default setting myself, but the option is there if you want to use it. The sound design is okay overall. Some people may find the announcer to be incredibly annoying. I've just learned to tolerate him. I will say though, one cool aspect of the sound design is that when you are going through a tunnel, even the announcer sounds like he's in the tunnel with you. It's a small thing, but it's a really neat touch.
Go! Slippery when wet.
The bottom line, even if you're an American and hate NASCAR, Nascar Rumble is still a must-play alternative racing game on the PS1. Part NASCAR, part Mario Kart, all fun. The racing is chaotic and fun, and the power-ups are really inventive. The tracks are well designed, and exploration is rewarded with the finding of shortcuts throughout the maps. This game is just a full chaotic tornado of fun. The PS1 has some great kart racing games like Crash Team Racing, but if you want to play the PS1's best stock kart racing game, look into Nascar Rumble. It's fondly remembered amongst PS1 gamers for a very good reason. And if Nascar Rumble interests you, or maybe you're just a huge fan of this game, EA did develop a PS2 sequel without the NASCAR license called Rumble Racing, which improved upon the original in a number of ways, like improving the power-ups, improving the handling and controls, and the best addition, borrowing the stunt ability from San Francisco Rush 2049, where you could spin your car around and do some cool mid-air flips, and giving the player a turbo boost for successfully landing said tricks. Rumble Racing is still one of the best alternative racing games on the PS2. If you're looking for a great PS2 racing game to play, look into Rumble Racing.
Reminds me of when I was shot out of that cannon.
I've always appreciated Slave Zero for the exact same reasons most people at the time of its release disliked the game. At its core, Slave Zero is an unapologetic, straightforward action game whose main focus is action over everything else. The level designs are mostly straightforward corridors filled with baddies to destroy with only the slightest hints of exploration added. The corridors usually open up into larger areas that act as rooms just to destroy more enemies. With a few exceptions being missions that have specific objectives, the game mainly consists of starting at point A, destroying everything there, then continuing through corridors while destroying enemies, to get to point B, where you destroy all the enemies. The sense of scale in the game is impressive, as Slave Zero is a 60-foot tall mech that towers above buildings and most enemies, and the concept and art direction hit on two things that I am a sucker for: blowing stuff up in a giant mech, and a cyberpunk / Blade Runner style atmosphere. The combat in the game is excellent. Unlike the average mech title, Slave is incredibly agile as he moves fast, jumps high, and the gunplay, which consists of switching between two weapon types, ballistic and energy, while strafing and also hitting enemies with rockets, is fantastic. I love the feel of the combat in this game. There's something to be said about taking on waves of enemies while juking and jiving around their rockets and forcing them to eat yours instead. The movement and aiming feels really good in this game despite the Dreamcast single analog stick and some major frame rate issues that really do put a damper on the combat in the later levels of the game. Slave Zero was released on the Dreamcast around a month after the system hit and is a first generation game with some poor first first generation optimization. People who really want to play this game should probably check out the PC version on GOG. It's also available on Steam, but in order to get the Steam version to run, you'll have to find all the fixes to get it to run right on a Windows 10 or newer system, which some users have posted in the game's discussion section. I really wish Steam would force some kind of compatibility on older games like this. I've never actually played the PC original, so my only experience with Slave Zero is the Dreamcast version. PC gamers speak highly of an old demo disc for PC Gamer magazine that had Slave Zero on it. I, however, was not a PC gamer until much later, so my first exposure to the game was a review in an issue of GamePro magazine, which first piqued my interest in the game. I can't find my copy of the issue where they reviewed the game, it's packed away somewhere, but off of memory, I want to say they gave the game a 4 out of 5, but don't quote me on that one. Sure enough, I hunted down the issue in an online archive to save myself the time of digging through multiple tubs of magazines, and they did give it a 4 out of 5. I can't remember the name of someone who just told me their name, but I can sure remember a GamePro review from over 2 decades ago. The Dreamcast port of the game, despite its major frame rate issues, is still a game I've always enjoyed for what it offers. It's simple yet action-packed. A lot of the reviews at the time bashed it for being a shallow, action-focused title, but that's really the beauty of Slave Zero. Unapologetically, this is a shallow action game that tosses deeper level designs or gameplay concepts to the side to excel at those action elements. The beauty is not every game has to be a deep ordeal. Sometimes you just want to jump into a 60-foot mech and start blowing stuff up for instant gratification. No thinking required. I've always appreciated the straight-up action focus of this game, the beautiful simplicity, and the fun of the gunfights. Slave Zero isn't trying to be Half-Life or even Shogo. It's trying to excel at action and atmosphere, and that's what I've always really liked about the game. It's not for everyone, especially not the Dreamcast port, but those who can appreciate a straight-up action game will find enjoyment out of Slave Zero. 500 years in the future, the Sovkhan rules the corporate dynasty over Mega City S19 with an iron fist. A small band of rebels filled with the descendants of an ancient warrior clan who have dubbed themselves the Guardians have managed to get their hands on a single slave unit. Giant mechs grown from embryos and fused with dark matter, and they've chosen one of their own, Chan, to permanently fuse with Slave Zero and fight his way through 15 levels to defeat the Sovkhan and his minions of evil slave mechs. The story isn't particularly deep, but it's told through cutscenes throughout the game, most of which are just a means of giving players the level objectives. I may have oversimplified the design earlier when I said it was just run, shoot, run, because there are a number of boss fights thrown in the game for good measure. Most of the boss fights dwindle down to just shoot the boss until it dies, but there are some that require different strategies. And there are occasional mission objectives thrown in, like having to protect the rebel base from attackers, protect embryos from attackers long enough for the rebels to steal them, and my personal least favorite, one convoy mission where you have to protect a convoy of ships while traversing the sewers. Failing to protect any of these ends in an instant game over. Luckily, the game isn't one that kicks you back to the title screen when you fail a mission, it just reloads the last checkpoint, which was at the last area loaded, so you only actually have to play each section from the start at a game over. The game doesn't allow you to save anywhere, but it does allow you to save at the beginning of each section. My suggestion is to have at least 2 rotating saves in the game, alternating which one you save at for each section in case you accidentally save yourself into a corner. If you barely scrape by in one portion of the level, you start the next section with the exact same amount of life you had when you left the previous section, and the exact same weapons you had. This can lead you to starting the next section with 1 hit left until you're dead, and sometimes you start out in a new area where there are a couple of enemies instantly firing at you, or you took a downgraded weapon into the next area, and the tougher enemies require the upgraded weapons to do more damage against them. After repeated failures at a level, it is sometimes advisable to reload the previous section and play it more carefully, making sure to pick up either the new upgraded weapons or sometimes the downgraded weapons actually work better against the enemies in the new section. Not running 2 saves caught up to me pretty quickly when I finally hit mission 12, where I foolishly stuck with a machine gun instead of the single-shot explosive cannon. In this mission, you have to protect an embryo from enemies trying to destroy it as your allies fly in to pick it up off of a train. I was playing on normal difficulty, but even then, the enemies were bullet sponges by this time in the game. This room features the worst frame rate issues in the Dreamcast port. Normally, the frame rate issues don't make it hard to aim in this game, but this one spot in the 12th mission is the exception. The frame rate got so choppy and the machine gun I was using to take down the sponges wasn't getting the job done by a long shot. I was about to give up on the normal difficulty and restart the game on easy because back in the day, a lot of PC to console ports were straight ports when it came to difficulty. A game that may have been easy or medium difficulty using a mouse and keyboard is quite a bit more difficult using a controller with little to no aim assist in the game. The frame rate would just drop down to an unplayable slideshow in this room. Before I chose to start over from the beginning on easy difficulty, I decided to check my other VMUs for my old save from almost 2 decades ago. And sure enough, I was also stuck on mission 12 in that save, but I did run 2 saves on my old game. In this save, I had the rocket launcher upgrade and the lightning gun, and I managed to beat this room on my first try. Just changing the weapons helped me succeed. That's why it's important to run at least 2 saves in the game in case you need to go back to the previous level and collect different weapons, or you need to start the new level with more life. The game's frame rate issues and sometimes insta-fail missions are really the 2 biggest complaints I wage against it. Generally, I have no problem playing an old console game that has frame rate issues, and for the most part, the frame rate in Slave Zero wasn't an issue for me except for in a couple of areas. I will say that this footage looks worse watching it than playing it. The later levels in the game have some major frame rate issues, yet I was still able to play through them just fine. This may not be the case for everyone, but years of playing N64 games means I can handle choppiness pretty well. I guess it's all up to your personal tolerance. However, the frame rate issues are why I can't suggest the Dreamcast port to most people out there. If you are the type of person who can tough through choppiness, you might enjoy the Dreamcast version if you find it for cheap. For everyone else, there is the PC version, which actually has background music and is cheaper in every form. Even picking up the physical PC disc is cheaper than the average asking price for the Dreamcast version. So even if you don't trust digital games, you can still find the physical PC version of the game for cheaper. Graphically, I've always loved the atmosphere in this game. I am a sucker for Blade Runner aesthetics. That dark tech noir visual style in huge futuristic cityscapes is always appealing to me, as is the scale and size of being in a giant robot blowing stuff up in a living, breathing city. The whole look of the graphics in the game takes me back to my early PC gaming days. I was relatively late to PC gaming outside of playing a couple of games on my dad's PC, mostly Alien vs Predator. When I was 19 or 20 years old, someone gave me a hand-me-down HP Office computer with a 533 MHz Pentium 3, 512 megabytes of RAM, maybe DDR, I can't fully remember, and it had an AGP slot. I didn't really understand the big hype of graphics cards. What few PC games I owned still looked great to me as far as I was concerned. However, on my birthday that year, I was at Walmart with my brother, and there on a shelf was an ATI Radeon 9000 graphics card. Yes, there was a time in which you could actually buy GPUs at Walmart. My bro picked it up for me for my birthday, and it wasn't until I finally booted up Shogo, which was a $10 game that came with Subterra Core in a double pack, and finally saw the game running in high resolution with texture filtering, either bilinear or trilinear filtering, I don't remember, that I finally understood what the fuss was about graphics cards. Slave Zero reminds me of that entire era of PC games. Its graphical details and art direction look pretty good for the Dreamcast, even if the frame rate has issues, but the whole look of the game is a nostalgic throwback to PC games in the mid to late 90s. I take one look at this game and I just think Voodoo 2, even though I never owned an actual Voodoo 2 card. If you want some alternative examples to what PC games of that era look like, aside from Quake or Unreal, look at games like Slave Zero. This game just has that nostalgic look of the PC games of that era. Obviously, the major frame rate issues of this console port mar the graphical presentation overall, but I still love the look and atmosphere of Slave Zero. The controls actually feel pretty good to use if you are either used to other Dreamcast shooters or used to N64 first-person shooters. By default, you use the face buttons to move and the analog stick to aim, but it feels a lot more accurate to me using the Dreamcast analog stick than the N64's. The aiming is by default inverted aim, which doesn't bother me because I still play inverted. It also shouldn't be a big deal to N64 shooter vets who are used to moving with the C buttons and playing with inverted analog controls. There are other control schemes you can pick from that might change the aiming if you can't handle inverted aim, but I didn't test any of them for this review. I just used the default because it felt good enough to me. Overall, the controls feel pretty good, and I was actually able to hit more accurate rail shots in this game than I am in Quake 3 on the Dreamcast using the same controller. It does take a bit of getting used to press up on the D-pad to jump in the game, but I didn't have a lot of problems hitting the jumps and the platforming elements in this game. I found myself adjusting to it pretty quickly. You also have to hold left on the D-pad and pull the right trigger to change your weapon, or hold left on the D-pad and pull the left trigger and wait for your crosshair to turn red to do things like pick up a different gun, or pick up a tiny human and pressing the same combination again to throw that human as they make a satisfying red splatter on a wall. Overall, the controls feel great when aiming and moving, with the only hitches being the inverted controls for some, and the awkwardness of having to hold a D-pad button and press another button to do things like change your weapon. And there are times where switching from your ballistic weapon to your energy weapon will cause a glitch where Slave Zero will make the animation like he just changed the weapon, but you won't be able to fire it, because for some reason he grabbed nothing. You have to change the weapon once more until he pulls out the proper one. This can sometimes get you killed in the middle of battle. There are also some other weird glitches like getting stuck on walls, or jumping up into walls that rear their heads, but I was always able to wriggle out of them. It's just annoying whenever you get stuck there for a little bit unable to move. From a sound perspective, the effects are well done, the voice acting is decently done, but the Dreamcast port doesn't have the background music that is present in the PC version. It has a silent ambience to it, which does make it feel a little more atmospheric, but having the same tunes as the PC version would have been nice. The only music in the game is in the opening and ending credits. The bottom line, even though I've always thoroughly enjoyed Slave Zero on the Dreamcast, with its technical issues and the fact that the Dreamcast version is more expensive than the PC version in both digital and physical form, I can't really suggest the Dreamcast version of Slave Zero to everyone. If you're collecting specifically for the Dreamcast, or have nostalgia for the Dreamcast version of the game, then it's definitely worth picking up if you can find it for cheap. For everyone else, check out the PC version of the game. It's simple, straight up fun. Even the Dreamcast version is fun to play despite its issues. Its visuals and gameplay are a nostalgic throwback to late 90s PC gaming, and overall it's an enjoyable experience. If you're looking for a game you can jump into and enjoy without a lot of deep thought required, then Slave Zero is a fantastic choice. And something I forgot to write into the review, even though I meant to, was that Slave Zero on the Dreamcast actually supports 4-player split-screen death matches, which is actually a really cool addition for those of you who still like local multiplayer. Either some ex-Wisdom Tree employee has trolled us all, or Super 3D Noah's Ark, or Super Noah's Ark 3D, however you choose to pronounce it, really was the product of Wisdom Tree, the Color Dreams branch-off known for making unlicensed Bible games for the NES, really did license the Wolfenstein 3D engine to produce an NES first-person shooter based on Clive Barker's Hellraiser movie, abandoning it after realizing the prototype cartridge for the NES would cost around $100 to make a profit, and after Doom hit. Not wanting to ruin the reputation of their Christian Games brand, they decided to take their already licensed Wolf 3D engine and make a first-person shooter based on Noah's Ark, first bringing it to the Super Nintendo and then later porting it to DOS. I've read multiple sources that seem to confirm that Super 3D Noah's Ark started as a game based on Hellraiser, so I'm going to take it as fact, even if deep down I still think it's an elaborate troll. I really don't believe anything I hear on the internet, but the sources say that's how the game started. Also, one of the long-held beliefs surrounding the game about id Software giving Wisdom Tree the Wolf 3D engine out of spite for censorship in the Super Nintendo version of Wolf 3D seems indeed to be a myth. I did read one article that said Noah's Ark directly copied all the maps of Wolf 3D, but when trying to find out how true that was, I found a really in-depth article about Super 3D Noah's Ark and the Super NES version of Wolf 3D on badgamehalloffame.com that, aside from being a super interesting read, I'll link the article in the description, it's actually a really good read if you're interested, answered the question on the levels for me. So I've never been able to get into Wolf 3D. While Doom is pretty easy to go back to and play, Wolf 3D, though incredibly important to gaming history, has never been able to draw me in like Doom does. I wasn't a PC gamer growing up, very few people I knew even owned computers, so I definitely wasn't able to experience Wolf 3D or Doom whenever they hit. For me, Wolf 3D's levels always just blended together and they all looked the same. I've never been able to get too far into the game, suffice Suffice it to say, this means that I've never owned or wanted to own the Super NES version of Wolf 3D, which I was completely unaware of until now is actually a brand new campaign with new levels. It wasn't a port of the DOS original. It was more like an expansion pack. To answer the question about Super 3D Noah's Ark, the enemies and weapons are direct reskins of the same enemies and weapons in the Super NES version of Wolf. The levels, however, are not. From my understanding of the BadGameHallOfFame.com article, Wisdom Tree actually designed their own levels and enemy placements, even if the enemies and bosses and guns are just reskinned from Wolfenstein. So as I said, I don't own the Super NES version of Wolfenstein to confirm if the levels are actually different in Noah's Ark, but I can confirm that the levels are not identical to the original DOS version. All that being said, in playing Super 3D Noah's Ark, two things have happened. One, I've actually had a lot of fun playing this game. While it might be an infamous bad game, it's based on a sound formula, and the combat is fun, the level designs are manageable, some have mazes, but there are a lot of open areas in the game as well, and overall I've come to really enjoy this game. The second weird side effect of playing this game is, I've actually been able to get into Wolfenstein 3D style first-person shooters now. As backwards as it sounds, playing the supposedly awful Bible first-person shooter has given me a new appreciation of Wolfenstein 3D. It's actually made me want to play more Wolf 3D, and even Blake Stone, which I picked up recently because I had 73 cents left on my Steam wallet from a previous purchase, and found it on sale for 55 cents. Now that's some bargain shopping right there, if you ask me, despite being an infamous bad game. Noah's Ark, I'll just call it Noah's Ark from now on instead of the mouthful that is Super 3D Noah's Ark or Super Noah's Ark 3D, is actually fun. This Steam re-release was released in 2015 for the game's 20-year anniversary, and has been optimized to run and control great on a modern system. They've implemented WASD controls with mouse aiming. This actually plays better than the Steam version of Wolf 3D and Blake Stone thanks to the optimizations made for the game. So I broke one of my cardinal rules when writing this review. I watched another channel's video review of this game, normally out of fear of subconscious plagiarism and fear of seeing how much better someone else has covered the game, better than I could hope to do on my best day. I don't freshly read or watch any other reviews on a game that I am reviewing. However, the LGR review of this game has informed me that this Steam re-release is running off of a Wolf 3D source port called EC Wolf. I hunted down EC Wolf, and now I have a better way to go back and experience the original Wolfenstein 3D. The Steam version is just Wolf in DOSBox, but EC Wolf allows for WASD and modern display settings. It makes the whole game run a lot smoother on modern hardware. The gameplay in Noah's Ark is, well, it's Wolfenstein 3D. The levels are a mixture of mazes and open areas, filled with keys to unlock doors, tons of hidden areas to find, and hordes of enemies to dispatch. Noah, armed with his trusty slingshot and feed, puts the unruly animals to sleep, as opposed to killing them. It's a goofy way to cover up the violence of a game like Wolfenstein 3D, but it works. The levels are filled with hidden areas and even a hidden level to find if you look hard enough. In Wolfenstein fashion, Noah traverses each level, sleeping his enemies while collecting keys, ammo, life pickups, and even knapsacks, which expand his ammo carrying capacity. Occasionally, there will be Bible trivia pickups, where correctly answering Bible questions about the story of Noah will reward players with much needed extra ammo and life. This is probably the one time in your life where you wish you actually paid attention in Awana as a kid, or to VeggieTales, whichever, along with the normal assortment of weapons from the basic slingshot to the Super Feeder 5000. The game also reskinned the two new weapons of the Super Nintendo Wolfenstein 3D, with the Cantaloupe Feeder and the Watermelon Feeder, which have their own separate ammo to find throughout the maps. The gunplay in the game is basic but has its own intensity. It's definitely not as intense or refined as the gunplay in Doom, but it has its own unique feel and strategies to it. By the time I got to level 5-2, I found myself incredibly low on ammo, picking up just enough ammo from each felled enemy to take out the next enemy. Honestly, I deliberately put this game on the easiest difficulty to get the footage for this review, or at least I thought I did. However, this game gets incredibly hard in the later levels. I had more difficulty with this game than I did with my most recent playthrough of Quake 4 on the second from hardest difficulty, but I'm probably just bad at Wolf 3D era shooters. I did find myself saving after every room and reloading after dying very swiftly. In fact, anything less than 100% health can lead to being killed in 1 or 2 hits. 3 hits tops and Noah is toast. Suffice it to say, I had a rough time in the later levels. There is an extra life system in the game where dying in a level will expend a life and start you back at the beginning of that level with the basic slingshot and 8 rounds of ammo. I would just reload my mid-level saves instead. I was getting my butt handed to me in a children's shooter, and it turns out that I went back to check, and I've realized that though I thought I was playing the game on super easy in order to get the footage, I was actually playing on some harder difficulty I don't remember selecting. So I started a new game at level 6 on super easy, and I wasn't dying in 1 or 2 hits. So I really don't know what difficulty level I was actually playing on. Let's just say the game gets absurdly tedious at higher levels of difficulty with constant deaths and having to play cat and mouse games to lure enemies out a door to shoot them, just to pick up the ammo they drop to have enough ammo to take out the enemy behind them in order to pick up the ammo they drop to take out the enemy behind them, all while trying to avoid getting hit even once, let alone twice, for an instant death, constant reloading saves, and insta-deaths. Now that I am back to playing on an easier setting, I am back to having a fun time again. Difficulty is good in some games, but sometimes it can lead to tedious loading and reloading of saves. I can say this game is a lot more enjoyable on easier settings. Yeah, I know, but I don't care about bragging rights. I just find it amusing that here I was thinking I suck at life for not being able to beat a kid shooter on the baby difficulty, only to find out I had it on a much higher difficulty than I thought. I mean, I'm still stuck on level 6-4 on that higher difficulty in a kid shooter, but at least I know it wasn't just me being terrible at the game. I mean, I am still terrible at the game, just not as terrible as I thought. The graphics and music are upbeat. You can tell this game was meant to be played by children, and the end result is a happy shooter. Honestly, I like the audio and visual presentation in this game. There's kind of a happy, uplifting air about the whole game. It's a silly concept, but a lighthearted one. Its gameplay is as serious as Wolfenstein 3D, but with a childhood exuberance about it. This game is goofy, but it puts a smile on my face when I play it. If you like goofy, uplifting things, the game is worth the cheap asking price, even if you're not big on Wolf 3D. Overall, the game has a lot of levels, 6 different bosses to defeat, and is a pretty solid example of Wolfenstein 3D style first-person shooters. The bottom line, Wolfenstein 3D is a game I've always wanted to like more than I actually did. However, Super 3D Noah's Ark has helped me to adjust to the style of Wolf 3D, and despite its legacy of being a so-called bad game, it's actually a really fun game if you can get into it. I guess I could say your opinion of this game will be based on how you feel about Wolfenstein 3D, or other pre-Doom first-person shooters like it. If you're a fan of Wolf 3D, there's a good chance you will find enjoyment in Super 3D Noah's Ark. This game is indeed not a fecal matter load of fornication. It's just a weird game, but a fun and uplifting one at that. If you like strange niche titles, pick this game up. It's cheap, it's simple, it's fun, it's goofy, and it's worth playing. I remember it like it was yesterday, Christmas Day 1997. My father had previously borrowed an issue of GamePro magazine from my brother and I in order to get the scoop on the hottest games coming out. That Christmas we received Nascar 98, Fighting Force, which I have fond memories of playing even if it didn't hold a candle to my beloved Streets of Rage, and my first introduction to the Tomb Raider series, Tomb Raider 2. I would later acquire the very disc I'm using for this review at a rummage sale for $10, and despite the awkwardness of jumping back from Tomb Raider 2 to the original, have since come to appreciate the original as probably the best in the original Tomb Raider series, even if Tomb Raider 2 is still my favorite. I've only in recent years acquired the rest of the series on the PS1 and PC, so my main experience with the original Tomb Raider series revolves around the first 2 Tomb Raider games. Brought up in the comfort of the British aristocracy, at 21 years old, Lara's life was forever changed when her plane went down during a skiing trip to the Himalayas. Forced to survive by herself, Lara would walk into a local village 2 weeks later. After her experience, Lara was hooked on adventure, and not even being disowned and cut off by her own family would stop her tomb raiding adventures, publishing the journals of which would bring her fame and fortune. Though the game's manual makes it seem as if Lara had only ever lived a life of comfort and had never been adventuring before, the story would later have a revision of sorts with the addition of young Lara in Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. The opening cinematic shows Lara being enticed by a lady named Jacqueline Natla into finding an ancient artifact known as the Scion, an artifact rumored to give immense power to the person who wields it. This, however, is not going to be an easy task, seeing as the Scion has been split into 3 pieces and spread throughout the ancient world. The game's story is unfolded through the use of CGI cinemas and in-game sequences, though storytelling in 1996 gaming had a minimal focus outside of RPGs. Tomb Raider's story is fairly cinematic compared to a lot of other games released in that period of time. Lara's quest for the Scion will span 15 levels in 4 locations, which include runes in Peru, Greece, Egypt, and ending in the lost city of Atlantis. The game's design is spectacular. The levels, though daunting at first, still show some of the best blending of exploration, puzzle elements, and action-based gameplay of that early 3D era of gaming. Core did an exceptional job in the level designs in this game, and the quality still shines through to this day. Games like Tomb Raider are the reason we all fell in love with 3D gaming. So I may as well just get it out of the way. The most incessant amount of whining I've heard levied against Tomb Raider by its detractors over the years pertains to the game's controls. I'll be the first to admit that Lair is insanely hard to control. Her control mirrors games like Resident Evil, where pressing up is the only way to move forward, regardless of the camera angle. This tank control scheme, as it was later dubbed, has an extremely steep learning curve, and her jumping system also has an extremely steep learning curve. However, controlling Lair is obviously not impossible, and the game does offer a very well made training mode for new players to get a handle on the controls. Though when you think about it, going back from modern control schemes to Tomb Raider's controls puts you at the same disadvantage those of us who jump from 2D control schemes that we were used to into new 3D control schemes at the dawn of the 3D era of gaming. If you're too young to have experienced the 3D revolution but want to know what it was like, go back and play Tomb Raider. One must also take into account that Tomb Raider started development and was released before analog gaming really took off. That being said, 8-way run controls with the D-pad, or even analog controls like those found in Mario 64, would not work for this game. Now you may wonder how I could make such a claim, but you must keep in mind that all the levels in Tomb Raider are on a square-based grid. The controls are more formulaic in nature to take advantage of a square grid. By using Lair's ability to look around and scoping out the jump in front of you, you can predetermine if you can make the jump with a simple forward jump, or if you need a running jump. This requires a little bit more discernment on the player's part than the average platformer game does, but Tomb Raider in general requires you to put a lot more thought into everything you do. The difficult controls also help combat a problem that plagued 3D games with a third-person perspective for years: bad camera angles. Tomb Raider does have its share of bad camera angles, but as I stated previously, you don't actually have to see the jump to make the jump. Lair's ability to look around means you can plot out your jump before you even start moving, with the confidence that you are going to make it, even if you're jumping blind. I'm not excusing bad camera angles, but as an early 3D game, they were still working out these simple mechanics that we take for granted in today's gaming. When jumping in Tomb Raider, it doesn't matter what the camera does, because there is only one way to move forward. Even if the camera shifts to a completely different view mid-jump, Lair will still make the jump. The tank controls may not be ideal, but they do have their advantages. Compared to modern games, the controls themselves also have an open feel to them. Lair does not automatically grab ledges. You have to manually hold a button in order for her to grab them. This can make the complicated controls feel more complicated, especially if you're used to modern games that automatically grab the ledges for you. I, however, like this aspect because it lets me have complete control over everything Lair does. I understand the merits of having characters automatically grab ledges, but it sometimes leads to control issues when trying to do things like drop down to a lower ledge in modern games that use it. To let go of a ledge in Tomb Raider, I just let go of the X button and she drops. In many modern games, sometimes just trying to fall down to the ledge below is made more complicated because characters usually turn around and grab the ledge as they fall. I realize these design measures in modern games are to prevent you from accidentally plummeting to your death from falling off the ledge, which can be a very common occurrence in Tomb Raider, but I still prefer to have complete control. The grab feature isn't perfect in Tomb Raider, but it still works great. Due to the square grid, you nearly have to be lined up perfectly with the ledge to grab it. There is some forgiveness for not being perfectly square to the ledge, but the game is still a lot less forgiving about it than most. This can oftentimes lead to Lair plummeting to her death because you weren't lined up just right with the ledge, and can lead to frustrating backtracking because of the save crystal system in the game. I've been playing Tomb Raider for over a quarter of a century now, and yes, even I sometimes fumble over the controls. However, modern control schemes didn't come to us overnight. It took years of refinements and tweaking of established control schemes to get where we are today. It also took the release of dual analog controllers, not available at the time of Tomb Raider's release, to finally get a good balance of camera plus movement controls. That being said, this game has an extremely steep learning curve when it comes to the controls. It always has. But that's just one of the things one must take into account when going back to play the original Tomb Tomb Raider series. You are forced to learn the tough controls under fire, and the game doesn't let up as soon as you start. If you've been spoiled by the soft touch of analog controls, going back to D-pad controls means you might literally play this game until your thumb bleeds. Not an attack on the controls, but if you've lost your old school callus, your thumb will be aching. Plus there are many other reasons why you'll be gripping your controller tightly, which I'll get into later. The bad thing about Tomb Raider's level designs are that oftentimes it's not clear what to do or where to go next. This is one of the biggest complaints against the entire series. The game doesn't hold your hand, and you will find yourself completely lost and backtracking through an entire level trying to figure out what to do in order to progress. In fact, complaints over this design choice were voiced so loudly, and the backlash against it so great, that even to this day developers have completely sterilized their games of really tough puzzle elements, making modern puzzle elements in adventure games so easy they not only feel insulting to your intelligence, being so watered down, but they practically show you the solution from the second you enter a room, making you wonder why they even bothered adding puzzles to begin with. But the great thing about Tomb Raider's level designs are that oftentimes it's not clear what to do or where to go next. In other words, the bad thing is the game doesn't hold your hand. But the good thing is the game doesn't hold your hand. I myself have spent countless hours being lost in Tomb Raider, probably more than most of those who levied complaints against the series in its heyday. And while I do agree it is frustrating being absolutely stuck in the game, spending hours upon hours trying to figure out where to go next only to have a simple solution pop up, there's still something so completely satisfying about finally figuring it out on your own without help. It's a tough form of satisfaction, one that you rarely see in gaming anymore. And after years of playing Tomb Raider and learning how to scan and search every inch of a level, I've found that very few games have been able to stump me since. I remember when Uncharted 2 first came out, I had a friend who was stuck on one of the puzzles for like a week. I came over and within 5 minutes solved it. I'm not saying that I haven't been stumped since, Shadow Man 2 and Primal come to mind, but because of the complaining, heavy puzzle focus in adventure games is a thing of the past, the exception being games like Zelda. Another complaint levied is with the puzzle objectives themselves. Yes, there is a lot of key grabbing, switch throwing, and block puzzles. The term and eventual hatred for block puzzles came from the backlash against Tomb Raider. When you understand that Tomb Raider has a unique blending of action and adventure with a heavy puzzle focus, and puzzle elements have tons of thought put into them. It's not the means of unlocking the objectives that's important, like throwing a switch or moving blocks a certain way. It's the journey in between. Each level itself is a giant puzzle unlocked through solving smaller puzzles. Core design took a lot of time designing every level in the game. There are no half-hearted puzzle elements in Tomb Raider. They are all well designed and well thought out, and the levels themselves are designed as one giant puzzle. Those who would criticize this game for its objectives being simple switch pulling, key gathering, and block puzzles tend to overlook the sheer amount of thought put into the level designs of this game. There is a certain attention to detail in the puzzle elements in this game that you rarely see anymore. And Tomb Raider isn't all puzzles. The game also shines in its action and adventure elements, which take place within the puzzle elements. As you may expect in typical Indiana Jones fashion, the ancient ruins are also filled with all sorts of booby traps, often sprung on you without warning. One can complain that this does lead to many cheap deaths, but the element of surprise adds to the tense atmosphere of the game, and the atmosphere is my favorite part of the game. Each level, aside from having a heavy puzzle focus, is rife with death traps and all sorts of baddies just waiting to pounce on you at any given moment. Some enemies are easy to see and easy to dispatch from the beginning of the level, but others are scripted to show up as you accomplish objectives. Pulling a switch or grabbing an item is the easy part. It unlocks the next part of the puzzle. However, it also unlocks consequences in the game. Just when you think you're safe, pulling that lever oftentimes brings enemies your way in areas you thought you had already cleared, or it springs a trap on you. You honestly never know what to expect. Add that to the fact that Lara is completely alone to explore, and the game has a sense of tension that rivals games in the survival horror genre. You honestly never know what to expect next, and you rarely feel safe in this game. You're alone, and you're in a hostile environment, with surprises around every corner. I've oftentimes found myself staring down a hallway in the game knowing knowing full well that I have to go down that hallway to progress, but telling myself that I don't want to. There's something down there, it's gonna get me and I know it. A feeling that easily rivals games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Sometimes you find yourself squeezing onto your controller for dear life, which adds to that pain in your D-pad thumb. There are so many unexpected surprises just waiting around every corner, whether it be an enemy lying in wait, or Pierre, the litterbug, who stalks Laura throughout most of the levels in the game, popping in at the most inconvenient times and disappearing just as fast. 2, and how could I not mention, one of the most memorable scenes of the game, and one of the most iconic scenes of that whole generation of gaming, the Tyrannosaurus Rex popping in to say hello. The music and sound effects in the game also add to the tension. Laura is usually surrounded in silence with some ambient sounds. You can hear everything in the environments around you, which adds to the lonely feeling in the game. Sometimes you can hear enemies around you, a growl breaking the silence and causing butt puckering. Yes, I really did just say that, as you run to the high ground for safety, so you can get a vantage point to see where the sound is coming from. Other times, at selected moments, one of the soothing themes plays, and adds almost a sense of wonder as you explore the ancient environments. It really does give you the feeling like you're the first person to see these environments in thousands of years. However, generally when you hear music in Tomb Raider, that means trouble is coming your way. Something bad is happening and you're filled with a sense of danger, and all you can think to do is run and hope you make it to the safety of high ground. You don't even know what you're running from yet, but the buildup of tension is done so well that fast-paced symphony music gets your adrenaline pumping and causes the aforementioned butt puckering. The voice acting in these story elements is surprisingly well done when you take into account that it was released in 1996, the same year as the original Resident Evil.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Tomb Raider's voice acting was spectacular for its time and still holds up pretty well to this day. The music composed by Nathan McCree can both be soothing and, depending on when it hits in the game, pulse pounding. As stated, it's used sparingly in the game, leaving the player to mostly hear the sounds that Laura makes and those of the surrounding environments. A ton of thought was put into the sound designs of this game, and it really does add to the atmosphere. Graphically, even for its time, the Tomb Raider series was never considered a top-tier example of PS1 graphics. The frame rate generally moves at a consistent level with some stuttering in large open areas, but it's not enough to affect the gameplay. The textures are pretty pixelated, and Laura, whose character model in the first Tomb Raider is only made up of roughly 350 polygons, has some triangular features. If you're a snob about early 3D graphics, then this game isn't for you. Not because you can't deal with the game's visuals, but because I can't deal with the annoying whining of those who still complain about PS1 graphics. It's design and gameplay that take precedent over visuals, and avoiding a game because it's ugly by today's standards is not a good reason to avoid a game at all. There are also a lot of clipping issues in the game, however this can actually be used to your advantage, allowing you to clip the camera through a door to see into a room you can't get to yet. Sometimes this can actually help you when you're trying to figure out where to go next. The Tomb Raider series didn't come into its own graphically by PS1 standards until Tomb Raider 3. Blocky, ugly textures pop in, clipping galore, and a number of glitches. Tomb Raider's visuals get the job done, but were never top-tier graphics on the PS1. Playing the game on the PS2 with texture smoothing on really cleans up the pixelated textures. I know that some people are dead set against adding any kind of filtering or smoothing options to PS1 games, but I am not one of those people, seeing as I played PS1 games on the PS2 longer than I actually played them on the PS1. Having the PS2's bilinear filtering improve the visuals of PS1 games feels more at home to me, because I would almost always turn smoothing on when playing PS1 games on my PS2. The reason I am playing this footage on the PS2 with upscaling instead of using a PS3 to upscale, like I normally would, is I couldn't get the PS3 to load into a level. It would just freeze up on me. I tried the 3 different copies of this game I own, and the same thing, just freezes up. The PS3's backwards compatibility emulation is really good, but it's not perfect. There are some games that either won't run or will have various visual and sound glitches. That's why it's always good to have a hardware solution as a backup. When you take into account that Tomb Raider was in development for 3 years prior to its release, putting the start of its development in 1993, you start to realize exactly how revolutionary its level designs were. There was next to nothing for core design to draw inspiration inspiration from in the 3D realm of gaming. Yeah, Prince of Persia in 2D, but there was nothing in 3D for Tomb Raider to draw from. Tomb Raider was the standard bearer for what used to be dubbed the action-adventure genre of gaming, despite the fact that Tomb Raider has only really been given credit for cementing women characters as viable lead characters in games by the mainstream gaming press. Tomb Raider also had a profound effect on 3D gaming as we know it. Was it the most influential game in 3D gaming? No, but it definitely played its part, and was one of the big name games responsible for the 3D gaming revolution. 1996 was a landmark year for 3D gaming, and a year that arguably helped shape the games we play today like no other year in gaming history. By 1996, the next generation of home consoles was in full swing, with the release of the Nintendo 64, which took analog technology and shrunk it down into a thumbstick. id Software dropped a bomb on PC gamers with a little game called Quake that no one could argue with its online functionality, the use of a Voodoo 3D accelerator in GL Quake, the ancestor to all modern graphics cards, something that has deeply influenced modern PC and especially console hardware, releasing the source code to the average gamer, which opened up the door to tons of user modifications like the original Team Fortress, and licensing of the game's engine to other developers, that Quake was possibly the most influential game that year, and one of the most influential games of all time. Tomb Raider is just as worthy to be mentioned in the same sentence as both Quake and Mario 64, because it as well had a huge effect on gaming, regardless of the fact that later backlash against the series, and this weird historical revisionism that has been going on as of late, has robbed it from its rightful place in gaming history. Tomb Raider helped change gaming. The bottom line. The original Tomb Raider is still and will always be a classic, with its excellent mixture of action, exploration, and puzzle solving in a sometimes wondrous and oftentimes tense atmosphere. It may not get the credit it deserves, but it's one of those games that every gamer should at least give an honest try. The learning curve is high, and as it should, the game gets harder as it goes along, with the final level being borderline insane with what's thrown at you. You'll die a lot, you'll struggle with the controls, but you may even come to appreciate the masterful design and unique atmosphere. If you've never played it, you should. And don't be a wimp and play something like Tomb Raider Anniversary instead. Tomb Raider since its release has been ported to almost every platform under the sun, from the PS1 to the Saturn to the Mac and the PC, to even the Nokia N-Gage. You can still find the original Tomb Raider series on Steam, and with the remaster coming out soon, you'll also be able to play an updated version. As far as the remaster is concerned, my only real concern is if people complained about the controls whenever they re-released GoldenEye, how much worse are people going to complain about the controls in the Tomb Raider remaster? See, if they're just doing a remaster and not a remake or reboot, you can't change the controls in the original Tomb Raider series without changing the entire map design. I'm interested to see how they're going to work with the controls, but then again, maybe the remaster is for people like me who never actually quit playing Tomb Raider. We'll see if they can draw on new fans with this. We'll see if people will be able to get over the steep control learning curve and enjoy Tomb Raider for its excellent design and atmosphere. I guess time will tell, and if you happen to like heavy puzzle elements in your action games, I also thoroughly suggest my favorite core design PS2 effort, Project Eden, which also had a PC version back in the day. It's not for everyone, it has quite a few technical glitches, and is more focused on exploration and puzzle solving than action. I'm guessing that most will find it a little boring and lackluster in the action elements, but gamers with an open mind will be able to appreciate it, as will any of those who own a PS2 multi-tap, because it has 4-player co-op support. Project Eden is flawed, yet still a very engaging title for those who can get into it.